Garrett Langley did not wait for silence before he started swinging. He moved through the morning crowd on Black Ridge's Main Street, like a man who had never once been told no. Thick-shouldered, silk-vested, the kind of handsome that money buys and cruelty preserves. In his right fist he held a leather strap, and he was already using it before anyone understood what was happening. The first blow caught Mabel Harper across the shoulder and spun her halfway around. The second opened a cut above her cheekbone. She went down on one knee in the dirt, both hands pressed flat against the ground, and Garrett stood over her and laughed. Actually laughed. While flour from her dropped basket drifted white across the street like snow that had no business being there. "Stay down," he said pleasantly. "That's where women like you belong." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. If this is the kind of story that makes your blood run hot, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of stories like this one. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning and tell it right. Oofs. Mabel Harper had been waking before dawn her entire adult life, and she had stopped expecting that to change. She was 26 years old, wide through the hips and shoulders, with hands that had grown rough from needlework and bread dough and hauling water before the rest of Black Ridge opened its eyes. Her husband Thomas had been dead 14 months. The influenza had taken him in 4 days flat, which still struck her as obscene. A man that large, that solid, reduced to nothing in 4 days. After the burial, she had sold the mule, kept the sewing kit, and figured out what she could do without crying about what she couldn't. What she could do: sew, bake, wash other people's laundry without complaint, keep herself fed and sheltered through the kind of stubborn daily arithmetic that doesn't look like courage from the outside but absolutely is. What she could not do: make Black Ridge like her. That was the plain truth of it, and she had mostly accepted it. The town had opinions about Mabel Harper the way it had opinions about weather, formed early, held firmly, and not much interested in correction. She was too big, too quiet, too strange in the way she sometimes stood perfectly still when a horse passed, watching it with a focus that made people uncomfortable. Widow women were supposed to shrink after their husbands died. Mabel had not shrunk. If anything, she had gotten more solid, more deliberately present, like a woman who had decided that if she was going to take up space, she was at least going to do it on purpose. This did not endear her to Black Ridge. That particular Tuesday morning, she had risen at 4:30, baked 24 loaves of bread in a pan of apple-filled pastry before the sun was fully up, packed everything into her flour sack basket, and set out for the market square. The walk was 12 minutes. She had made it hundreds of times. She kept her eyes on the street ahead and her shoulders back and tried not to notice the way conversation dropped and rearranged itself as she passed. The way women touched their children's arms and steered them slightly sideways. The way old Pete Drummond outside the feed store looked at her with that particular expression that said he found her existence mildly offensive. She bought her supplies from Miller's Dry Goods: salt, lard, 2 yards of muslin, paid with exact coin, thanked the clerk by name, and turned back toward home. Garrett Langley was standing in the middle of the street. He was alone, which was unusual. Garrett generally moved with at least 2 men behind him. His father's hired hands, whose actual job was to stand slightly behind Garrett and look agreeable. But that morning he was alone, leaning against the post outside the Silver Spur Saloon with his arms folded and his hat tilted just enough to suggest he'd been out all night and found it entertaining. Mabel saw him. He saw her see him. She adjusted her route to give him wide clearance, the way you'd walk around a dog that had bitten before. "Mrs. Harper." His voice landed in the morning air like a stone dropped in a puddle, flat, deliberate, spreading. She didn't stop walking. "Mr. Langley." "Where you headed so early?" "Home." One word, eyes forward. She heard him push off the post, heard his boots on the packed dirt. He had a loose, unhurried stride, the walk of a man who had never once needed to hurry for anything in his life. He came around in front of her and stopped, and she had no choice but to stop too unless she was going to walk directly into him. "You're not much for conversation," he said. "I'm much for getting home before the heat comes up." Garrett looked at her the way he might look at something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his boot. Curious, vaguely disgusted, not particularly troubled by any of it. He was 24 years old and the only son of Hector Langley, who owned the grain mill, 2 warehouses, and a substantial portion of the town's goodwill. Garrett had understood from an early age that this meant he could do more or less whatever he liked, and he had spent the years since proving that understanding correct. "I heard you're good at sewing," he said. "I am." "And cooking?" "Yes." What else are you good at?" There was something in the way he said it, a particular quality of patience, like a man holding a handful of cards and deciding when to lay them down. Mabel looked at him directly. "Mr. Langley, I've got bread to put up and a house to tend. Is there something specific you needed, or are you just practicing being unpleasant?" Something shifted in his face. Not anger exactly, more like surprise, and then the decision to find it funny. "You know," he said slowly, "I was going to ask you something decent. Thought maybe I'd offer you a situation. A woman like you, no husband, no real income. I thought I'd be doing you a kindness. A situation. A position. At the house. My father's got—" "I know what your father's got," Mabel said, "and I know what you mean by a position, and the answer is no." The amusement left his face completely. It happened fast, the way some changes happen fast, a door swinging shut. One moment he looked almost pleasant, and the next moment he looked like an entirely different person, narrower through the eyes, something hard showing underneath the polished surface. "No," he repeated. "No," she said again. Steady. She was proud of steady. "You understand that I'm offering you something, that women in your circumstance— my circumstance is my own," Mabel said, "and your offer is an insult dressed up as generosity, and I'm not interested in either one. Good morning, Mr. Langley." She stepped around him. She got perhaps 4 steps down the street before he spoke again, and this time his voice had dropped to something quiet and specific and dangerous. "You'll regret being smart with me." She kept walking. She told herself that was the right decision, that engaging further was stupid, that Garrett Langley's wounded pride was his problem to manage and not hers. She was wrong about that last part, and she found out how wrong within the hour. She heard the commotion before she reached her doorstep. 2 of her neighbors, women who had never once spoken to her with anything warmer than civil indifference, were standing outside their houses watching the street with the particular alertness of people who know something bad is about to happen and have decided to watch rather than interfere. "You'd best go inside," one of them said when Mabel came up the walk. Her name was Ruth Calder, a sharp-faced woman with 3 children and a husband who drank moderately. She was not cruel exactly. She was the kind of woman who conserved her decency for situations where spending it cost her nothing. "What's happening?" Mabel asked. Ruth looked at her with something complicated moving behind her eyes. "Garrett Langley's been telling people you stole from Miller's." The word landed like a physical impact. Mabel actually stopped walking. "He what?" "Said you took coin from the register while the clerk wasn't looking. Said he saw it himself." Ruth's voice was level, reporting, deliberately, without opinion. "He's been saying it up and down the street for the last 30 minutes. "I didn't steal anything." "I know," Ruth said. And then, and this was the part that would stay with Mabel for a very long time, Ruth turned and went inside and closed her door. Mabel stood on the street with her basket in her hands and understood, with a clarity that was almost calm, that she was entirely alone in this, that no one was going to step forward and say what they knew, because saying it would cost them something and she was not worth that cost. She was a fat widow woman who made good bread and kept to herself, and in the mathematics of Black Ridge, that added up to nothing worth protecting. She was still standing there, working out what to do, when Garrett came around the corner with 4 men behind him. She recognized 2 of them, Hector Langley's hands, the ones who usually trailed Garrett around. The other 2 she didn't know by name but knew by type, the kind of men who found someone else's certainty intoxicating, who fell in behind strength because having conviction of their own was too much work. Garrett pointed at her. That was all. Just pointed, like she was a thing he'd been looking for and had finally located. "That's her," he said. "That's the thief." "I didn't steal from anyone." Her voice came out steady. She was desperately glad for that. "I paid for everything I took, 2 yards of muslin, salt, and lard. You can ask Miller himself." "Miller didn't see you do it," Garrett said pleasantly. "I did. You were across the street. I've got good eyes." He kept walking toward her, steady, unhurried, and something in that unhurriedness made her stomach drop. This wasn't improvised. He'd had 30 minutes to plan this, to gather his audience, to figure out exactly how he wanted it to go. "You've got a nerve," he said, "standing there lying to my face after what you did, after what you said to me this morning." "What I said to you this morning was no," Mabel said. "And I'll say it again." He swung before she finished the sentence. Not with a fist, with the flat of his hand, open-palmed, which somehow made it worse, because it was contemptuous rather than violent, the kind of blow you give something you don't even consider worth a proper fist. It caught her across the jaw, and the force of it knocked her basket from her hands. Bread scattered across the dirt. The flour sack crumpled. 2 months of early morning spilled out in the street like it was nothing at all. The crowd that had gathered, and there was a crowd, because there always was, drawn by the particular gravity of humiliation, made a collective sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite nothing. Mabel caught herself against the post of the nearest fence. Her ears were ringing. Her jaw sent a bright specific line of pain up into her cheekbone, and she pressed her hand against it and straightened up and looked at him and said, through teeth that didn't want to unclench, "That was assault." "That was a lesson," Garrett said. Then he nodded to the 2 men she didn't know, and they came forward. And then it wasn't his hand anymore. And the crowd watched, and the crowd did not move. And Mabel understood in the part of her brain that was still working clearly that no one was going to stop this. That she was in the street in the morning in a town where she had lived for 4 years. And not one person among the 30 or 40 watching was going to say stop. She went down once and got up. She went down a second time and took longer getting up. By the third time, her ribs had become something she couldn't breathe around properly. Each inhale a negotiation, and she was on her hands and knees in the dirt among the scattered remnants of the bread she'd baked at 4:30 that morning. And she thought with a very specific and almost peaceful clarity, "This is where I am. This is actually where I am." Garrett crouched down in front of her, not to help, just to be closer, to make sure she could see his face clearly. "This is what happens," he said quietly, "when a woman like you forgets what she is." The crowd was silent. Someone coughed. Someone's horse shifted on its hitching post. The sound of the town going about its business filtered in from farther down the street, indifferent. She tried to get up. Her arms shook. And then there were boots in the dirt beside her. Not Garrett's, not the others. Different boots, worn and trail-dusted, planted in the dirt like they'd been grown there. A shadow fell across Garrett's face. He looked up, and something moved in his expression. Not fear, not yet, but the early edge of it. What? Colt Maddox had ridden into Black Ridge for a bag of oats and a new cinch buckle, and that was genuinely all he'd intended to do there. He was 34 years old, lean through the jaw, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that had the quality of seeing more than they announced. He had been in Black Ridge once before, 2 years back, and had not much liked it then and had no particular reason to like it better now. He came in maybe 4 times a year when he couldn't avoid it. He bought what he needed, spoke to as few people as possible, and left. He had come around the corner from the livery and seen what was happening from about 40 feet away, and he had stopped walking for perhaps 2 seconds, not from indecision, but from the specific calculation of a man who has learned that stepping into things wrong can make them worse. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the 4 men. He looked at the woman on the ground. 2 seconds. That was all. Then he walked forward. The crowd shifted slightly to make room, the way crowds do when they sense that the person moving toward the center of things has decided something irrevocable. Colt didn't run, didn't shout, didn't put his hand on his gun. He walked to where Garrett was crouching, and he stopped and he looked down at the man from a height that required Garrett to tilt his head up. "Walk away," Colt said. Just that. Quiet. Conversational almost, except for what was underneath it, which was not conversational at all. Garrett rose to his full height and found that he still needed to look up slightly, and didn't like it. "This is none of your concern," he said. "I'm making it mine." Colt looked at the 2 men behind Garrett, not threatening, just looking. The way you look at something you're measuring and finding lighter than you expected. Both of them glanced away. He looked back at Garrett. "You're done here." "You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly what I'm talking to," Colt said. "A man who puts 4 people to work hitting a woman alone in the street and calls it a lesson. I know the type." Garrett's jaw tightened. "She's a thief." "She's not. But even if she were, this isn't justice, and you know it." Colt held his gaze for another moment, steady, unblinking, with a patience that was more unsettling than aggression. And then he crouched down beside Mabel. She was braced on one hand, the other pressed to her ribs, and she looked at him with an expression that had gone beyond pain into something more complicated. Exhaustion, wariness, and beneath those, something so carefully controlled he almost missed it. Shame. The particular shame of having been hurt publicly, which is its own specific wound separate from the hurt itself. He looked at her face, the cut above her cheekbone, the bruising already rising along her jaw. The way she was holding her torso told him about the ribs without her saying anything. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, made it halfway and stopped, breath catching, hand pressing harder against her side. Colt didn't ask again. He put one arm behind her knees and one across her back and lifted her, and someone in the crowd made a sound, a laugh, bitten off halfway, the sound of a person who started something and then thought better of it when Colt turned his head and looked. He stood with her in his arms, and she was not light, and he did not make anything of that, did not shift his grip or adjust his expression, just stood the same way he'd stand if he were carrying anything that mattered. Mabel looked at him. He looked back. This close he could see her eyes clearly, dark brown, intelligent, red-rimmed, and wet but not spilling. The eyes of a woman who had decided some time ago that she was not going to cry in front of these people if she could possibly avoid it. "You'll stand with me," he said quietly. She stared at him. Behind them, someone in the crowd actually laughed. The full laugh, unchecked, the laugh of someone who found the image ridiculous, a man carrying a woman that size, making those words sound like something meaningful. Colt did not look at whoever laughed. His eyes stayed on Mabel's face. "I know," she said. Her voice was barely there. "I know how it looks." "I know how it looks too," Colt said. "I don't much care." He carried her to the doctor's office on the east side of the street. Doc Heller was 60 years old and had seen enough to not make speeches, which Colt appreciated. He looked Mabel over with the brisk thoroughness of a man who has learned that efficiency is its own form of respect, confirmed 2 broken ribs, cleaned and closed the cut on her face, and said she'd need at least 2 weeks of rest. "And then what?" Mabel asked from the examining table, directed at no one in particular. "Rest first," Doc Heller said. "Then the rest of the questions." Colt sat in the wooden chair in the corner and said nothing for most of this. When Doc Heller stepped out to get bandaging supplies, Mabel looked at him from the table. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know. I don't know you." "Colt Maddox. I've got a ranch about 6 miles northwest of town. I come in a few times a year for supplies." He paused. "That's most of what there is to know." "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Garrett Langley's father runs half this town." "I'm aware." "He'll cause you trouble." "He can try." His voice was flat, not dismissive. The voice of a man who has thought about this already and decided it falls within an acceptable range of trouble. She watched him for a moment. "You married?" Something moved across his face, a very fast shadow, there and gone. "No." "You got people out at that ranch?" "No." "So you just ride in, pick fights with the richest man's son, and ride home alone." Her tone was not quite sarcastic, more like she was reading something aloud to see if it made sense. "That's about it today," Colt said. Doc Heller came back. The conversation closed. Afterward, in the street, with Mabel moving carefully beside him, she had refused to be carried again, which he respected. Colt asked the direct question. "You got somewhere to go?" She was quiet for a moment. "I've got a house." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. He watched her working through something, the particular internal argument of a person who has been self-sufficient long enough that accepting anything feels like giving ground. "I can manage," she said. "I'm sure you can." "That's still not what I asked." He stopped walking and turned to look at her. "Langley's going to come back. Maybe not today. Maybe not even this week. But that man's got his pride dented and money behind him, and that combination doesn't forget." He said it without drama. Just the observation. "My ranch has room. The work is real. I'm not offering charity. I need someone who can cook, keep a house, and I've got a horse that's been injured and needs daily attention. I'll pay fair wage plus room and board." She looked at him. There was a long silence during which he could see her measuring it, measuring him, measuring the alternative, doing some version of that daily arithmetic she'd clearly been doing since long before today. I don't know anything about you, she said finally. No, he agreed. That's not a small thing. No, he agreed again. She turned and looked down the street toward where her house sat, ordinary and still, and beyond it toward the mill where Hector Langley's name was painted in letters 2 feet high. She pressed her hand gently against her ribs. How far did you say the ranch was? 6 miles, northwest. She was quiet for another moment. I'll need to get some things from the house. I'll wait, Colt said. He waited outside while she went in. She came out 20 minutes later carrying a canvas bag that held everything she was taking, a small sewing kit in a wooden box that had been her mother's, 2 dresses, a wool blanket, a battered copy of an agricultural almanac with pages bent at corners throughout, and a single photograph that she tucked into the bag without him seeing clearly. She did not look back at the house. He noticed that and said nothing about it. The ride out of Black Ridge was quiet. He put her on his horse and walked beside, which she tried to argue against and lost. Not because he insisted loudly, but because the argument died naturally when her ribs protested a second attempt to get down. You don't have to do that, she said from the saddle. Walk, I mean. It's 6 miles, he said. Horse doesn't need the extra weight. It was said so practically, so entirely without any implication of commenting on her specifically, that she couldn't find an angle to take offense at it, and after a moment stopped trying. The land changed as they moved northwest, the packed dirt and shingled rooflines of Black Ridge giving way first to open grassland, and then to the gentler roll of low hills with cottonwoods along the creek lines. The morning had become full and bright, which felt almost insulting given what the morning had been. She had left her house with bread to sell. She was returning to a stranger's ranch with broken ribs and a cut face and everything she owned in a canvas bag. She was alive. She kept coming back to that. She was alive and the bread was in the dirt, and 2 of her ribs were broken, and she was on a horse belonging to a man she didn't know who apparently picked fights with the most powerful family in the county because he found their behavior unreasonable. Whether that was courage or recklessness or some combination she hadn't worked out yet. Why? She asked. He was walking slightly ahead, watching the trail. Why what? Why did you stop? In the street. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just thinking. She was starting to realize that was his default, that the pauses were him actually organizing thoughts rather than avoiding the question. Because 4 men and 1 woman on the ground in the street isn't a fight, he said. It's something else. Half that town thought it was a lesson she deserved. I know. His voice was even. Most of that town would watch a man drown in a puddle if they thought he'd earned it somehow. You don't know me, she said. You didn't know if I'd stolen anything. Your face when he said it. He glanced back at her briefly. Stolen people don't look like that. Like what? Like they've been hit twice. Once by the accusation, and once because they know no one's going to believe them regardless. She had no answer for that. She rode in silence for a while, one hand flat against her ribs, the other loose on the saddle horn. Mabel Harper, she said finally. It felt like something she should have said earlier. I know, Colt said. I heard his boy say your name. People know things about me in that town that aren't kind. I expect. I'm telling you, so you know what you've gotten yourself into. He looked back at her again, and this time held it for a moment. Mrs. Harper, he said, I've gotten myself into a walk across 6 miles of decent country on a clear morning. Everything else we'll figure out when we get there. The ranch came into view around a long bend. A 2-room house, solid but plain, with a front porch that needed one of its posts replaced, and a barn that was larger than the house and in considerably better repair. A paddock ran along the east side of the barn, and in it, standing at the far fence with her head low, was a dark bay mare. Something happened to Mabel when she saw the horse. Colt noticed it. The shift in her posture, the way her attention reorganized itself completely, the way she was suddenly leaning forward in the saddle. That's the injured horse? She asked. Her name's Della. Spooked at something 6 weeks ago, came down hard on her right foreleg. It's healed mostly, but she won't let anyone near the leg still. Won't let anyone near her much at all right now. He paused. She'll bite. What does she do when she bites? He thought about it. Commits to it. Mabel made a sound that astonishingly was almost a laugh, choked off by her ribs, ending in a wince, but there, brief and real and entirely unexpected, in the middle of this wrecked morning. She committed to it, Mabel said. All right. He helped her down from the horse, carefully, with the pragmatic competence of someone who has helped injured people dismount before, and knows that efficiency is kinder than ceremony. She put both feet on the ground and stood very still for a moment, organizing her body around the ribs. Kitchen's this way, he said. I know what a kitchen is. I know you know. I was just establishing where it is. She followed him onto the porch and through the front door. The house was clean in the way of a man who has lived alone for a while and keeps order by habit rather than preference. No clutter, nothing unnecessary, everything functional and in its place. The kitchen was at the back, small but sensible, with an iron stove that had been well maintained and a window that looked out over the paddock where Della stood. Mabel put her bag down on the kitchen table and stood at the window. Della hadn't moved from the far fence, head still down. Something in that posture, the specific quality of an animal that has been hurt and is waiting to be hurt again, made Mabel's chest do something complicated. You said the work is real, she said. It is. Then let me start. Not today. I can't do much today, but tomorrow. Colt looked at her. The cut on her face had been closed cleanly by Doc Heller, but the bruising had darkened since morning, and he could tell by the way she held herself that every breath was a considered decision. You need rest, he said. I know what I need. Her voice was not sharp exactly, more like a door held firmly in a frame. I also know what happens when you spend too long being still. You start to believe that's what you are. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Tomorrow. For now, I'll make coffee. I can make coffee. Your ribs will argue about that. My ribs argue about everything, she said. That's not new. There was a pause between them. Not uncomfortable, something more like two people taking quiet measure of a new arrangement and finding it tentatively workable. Thank you, Mabel said. It came out plainly, without decoration. For what you did in town. Don't thank me, he said. I hate that town. That's not a reason to put yourself in front of Hector Langley's boy. Maybe not, he said. And then, honestly, with the honesty of a man who doesn't bother to be modest about things he's made peace with, but it's the reason I did. He went to put the coffee on. She stood at the window watching Della stand at the far fence with her head low, both of them at the beginning of something they had no clean name for yet, the kind of beginning that doesn't feel like anything special in the moment, because you don't yet know what it will become. Outside, the morning held its silence. The mare did not move. The prairie stretched out long and indifferent and wide. Mabel pressed her hand lightly against her ribs, felt the steady pain there, and breathed through it, and stayed standing. That was enough, for now. That was the whole of what was required. She stayed standing. The coffee was bad. Not terrible in the way of coffee made carelessly. It was clear Colt had been making it the same way for years, measuring by habit, timing by instinct. But it was the coffee of a man who had stopped expecting anything from it, beyond the basic function of keeping him awake. Mabel sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the cup and said nothing about this. She drank it. She was not in a position to have opinions about coffee today. Her ribs had settled into a steady, informative ache that spiked sharp whenever she turned too quickly or forgot to brace before a breath. The cut above her cheekbone had been closed neatly by Doc Heller's experienced hands, but the bruising had gone deep violet blue across most of her jaw, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of a storm on the horizon, present, unavoidable, requiring acknowledgement. Colt had given her the smaller of the two rooms, which held a cot, a wool blanket folded at the foot, and a window that faced east. He'd said nothing about it beyond showing her where it was, and she'd said nothing beyond thank you, and they'd left it at that. She had slept poorly. Ribs, strange ceiling, the particular hyper-alertness of a person in an unfamiliar place, and had been awake before the sky was fully light. She had lain there listening to the ranch come alive, the horses stirring in the barn, the distant sound of Colt moving in the kitchen, the specific scrape of the iron stove door, the clunk of the kettle, the sound of a man who got up before dawn because he always got up before dawn and saw no reason to discuss it. By the time she made it to the kitchen, moving carefully with her hand resting light against her ribs, the coffee was already on the table. He looked at her when she came in and looked away quickly, not from discomfort, but from the particular tact of a man who had decided not to comment on how bad she looked, which was kind in its own wordless way. Sleep? He asked. Some. Ribs? Unpleasant company, she said, but I've had worse. He sat across from her with his own cup, and they drank in silence. And outside the window, Della stood at the same fence she'd occupied yesterday, same low-headed posture, same studied stillness. Watching that horse, Mabel thought about the way certain kinds of pain worked. How it wasn't the hurt itself that lasted longest, but the expectation of more hurt, the way the body started treating stillness as the only safe condition. She eat this morning? Mabel asked, nodding toward the window. Some. Not much. Colt followed her gaze. She used to be different, before the fall. Good horse, easy in company, didn't spook easy, worked well. He paused. She's still good. She's just gone somewhere I can't reach. Mabel understood that, though she didn't say so. Can I go out to the paddock today? She asked. He looked at her, took in the bruising, the careful way she was sitting, the hand still resting against her side. You're supposed to rest. I know what I'm supposed to do, Mabel said. I'm asking what you'll allow. The word allow seemed to land in a specific way. He turned his cup in his hands once, thinking, I won't stop you, he said. But if you tear something that Doc Heller closed up, I'm the one who has to ride back to town for him. I won't tear anything. I know you believe that. I also know my own body, she said quietly, better than most people would think. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and something passed between them that wasn't yet trust, but was in the neighborhood of it. The recognition of two people who have both, separately, learned to be honest about what they can and cannot do. Paddock's fine, he said. Don't try to touch her leg. I won't go near her at all today, Mabel said. I'm just going to be in the same space. He looked like he wanted to say something about that approach, and then decided against it. She went out after breakfast, the breakfast she had insisted on making, which had involved a negotiation about the stove that Colt had eventually conceded when it became clear she was going to stand at it regardless. And she moved across the yard slowly, ribs counting each step, and climbed carefully through the paddock fence rather than over it. Della's head came up immediately. She was a beautiful animal, even in her current state, dark bay, nearly black across the shoulders, with a white star on her forehead and the kind of bone structure that spoke to serious breeding somewhere back in her line. Her right foreleg, the injured one, showed the healed scar tissue of a bad impact, but she was standing on it, which was something. Her eyes, though. Her eyes were the thing. Wide, ringed with white, moving constantly to track possible threats. The eyes of an animal that had not slept properly in weeks because sleep meant you stopped watching. Mabel stopped when she was 20 feet away. Didn't advance. Didn't hold her hand out. Didn't make soothing sounds. She just stood there. Della watched her with those white-rimmed eyes, nostrils working, ready to move. Mabel looked at a point just past the horse, not directly at her, which could read as a challenge, and stood with her arms loose at her sides, and her weight even and simply occupied the space. Not pushing, not asking, not doing anything at all except being present without threat. After perhaps 5 minutes, Della's nostrils slowed. After 10, her head dropped an inch. Mabel stood there for 20 minutes in total, which was approximately 19 minutes longer than her ribs wanted her to stand anywhere. And then she walked back to the fence and climbed through carefully and went inside. Colt was watching from the porch. He said nothing when she came up the steps. She's not mean, Mabel said. She's scared. I know she's scared. Scared and mean look the same from the outside. They're not the same from the inside. Mabel leaned against the porch post carefully. You have to give her a reason to believe the world contains something besides the thing that hurt her. Colt was quiet for a moment. He had the posture of a man who had heard something that had reached further than the conversation it came in on. She's had time, he said. 6 weeks. Time doesn't fix it, Mabel said. Presence does. Consistent, patient presence that doesn't ask for anything. She paused. Though I expect you know that already. He looked out at the paddock. I've been giving her space, he said, because she seemed to want it. She wants it the way I wanted the house to myself after Thomas died, Mabel said. Which is to say, it felt safer than the alternative, but wasn't actually helping anything. The silence that followed that was a specific kind. The silence of a man receiving something that has come at him sideways, that he wasn't prepared to receive but can't quite argue with. Thomas was your husband, he said. 14 months gone. She said it plainly. Influenza. 4 days. I'm sorry. So am I. She straightened carefully. I'll start on the house today. The cleaning. I can do that sitting down, mostly. She went inside before he could say anything else about resting. What she found inside the house, once she looked at it properly, was a place that had been inhabited by a man who had stopped imagining anyone else in it. The basic maintenance was there, nothing broken, nothing dirty past function, but there was a quality of diminishment to it, rooms that had been contracted to their minimum purpose. The small bedroom she'd been given showed evidence, faint but readable, of having once held more than a cot. A slightly darker rectangle on the wall where something had hung and been taken down. A hook on the door with nothing on it. She cleaned the kitchen first because that was sensible, and because she could do it in stages. Sit to rest, stand to work, sit again, which was a rhythm her ribs could negotiate. She found, in the back of the dry goods cabinet, the ruins of a spice shelf, most of it empty, the remaining contents long past useful, and a crock of flour that was still good. She found cornmeal. She found a ham hock in the cold box that had perhaps 2 good meals left in it. By midday, she had the kitchen clean, a pot of ham and bean soup working low on the stove, and a pan of cornbread mixed and waiting. She was also sitting down at the table with her forearms flat on the wood and her eyes closed, which is where Colt found her when he came in from the barn. "Soup's on the stove," she said without opening her eyes. "Another hour." "You should be lying down." "I should be doing a lot of things," she said. "I'm sitting, which is a compromise." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. She heard him pour water from the pitcher, drink, set the cup down. "Della let you near her today?" he asked. "I didn't try to get near her today. Tomorrow, I'll get closer." She opened her eyes. "It takes as long as it takes. You can't hurry it." "I've been trying to work with her for 6 weeks," he said. There was frustration in it, carefully held. "And how has hurrying been going?" He looked at her. After a moment, something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in that direction. "Point taken," he said. "She's going to need to decide for herself," Mabel said. "All you can do is be worth deciding toward." The soup moved on the stove. The afternoon settled around the house. Colt asked her after a while where she'd learned about horses, and she told him about her father's farm in Kansas. Not a good farm, not a prosperous one. The kind of place that requires everyone on it to be useful from an early age. She'd worked the horses because no one else wanted to, and found she was good at it in a way she couldn't explain except that it required the same thing she'd always had the most of, which was patience. "Thomas didn't keep horses?" Colt asked. "We couldn't afford them. Thomas worked the grain elevator in Black Ridge, steady work." She paused. "Dull. He hated it, but he was good at it, and it kept us." Another pause. "He was a good man. Just not suited to what his life required of him. We were neither one of us quite where we were supposed to be, I think." It was more than she'd intended to say. She felt Colt register it and not push on it, which was correct. "You've been in Black Ridge how long?" he asked. 4 years. Came out with Thomas when he got the elevator job." She looked at the window. "Stayed because leaving requires a plan, and a plan requires resources, and resources take time to gather. And now?" She considered the question. The now of it, the 6 miles northwest of town, the unfamiliar kitchen that smelled like ham and cornbread and was slowly becoming a place where she was spending today. "Now I'm here," she said. "We'll see what that is." The second week established a rhythm. Not a comfortable one, not immediately. Routines require friction before they smooth out, and there was plenty of friction. Mabel had strong opinions about how a kitchen functioned. Colt had spent years making the kitchen function around the single operational principle of keeping himself alive, which is not the same thing at all, and there were several wordless negotiations conducted entirely through the positioning of objects that both of them pretended were not happening. She moved the coffee things to the left side of the stove. He moved them back. She moved them left again. He looked at her. She looked at him. He left them on the left. She found his system for the dry goods cabinet baffling. Things grouped not by category or frequency of use, but by some internal logic she couldn't decipher. "Why is the salt next to the axle grease?" she asked on the 4th day. "They're the same size tin," he said from somewhere behind her. She stood there for a moment. "That is a reason," she said finally. "It's not a good reason. It's worked for 3 years." "A lot of things work without being good," she said, and reorganized the cabinet. He didn't move it back. She filed that away. Her ribs improved in increments. The swelling across her jaw faded through yellow, and then to a greenish shadow, and then to something you had to look for. She worked within what the ribs allowed, which expanded slowly as the days passed. More standing, more lifting, more of the ranch house being returned to something livable. She beat the rugs, which cost her a day of sitting afterward. She patched 2 shirts of Colt's that had been folded in a pile waiting for someone to do it, apparently, since sometime last fall. "These were just sitting," she said, holding them up. "I was getting to them." When Eventually, she pressed her mouth together and let it go. Della was the project that mattered most to her, and she worked it the way she worked everything, methodically, patiently, without announcing her progress. Each morning she went to the paddock and stood at a distance that didn't threaten, and each morning that distance shrank by a few feet as the mare's nervous system gradually recalibrated what constituted safe. By the end of the first week, Della was turning to face her when she entered the paddock, not moving toward her, but orienting, which was different from the flat, fearful avoidance of day one. By the end of the second week, Mabel was close enough to the fence line that Della could smell her if she chose. She stood still and let the mare work through whatever internal calculation was happening, and after a long minute, Della took 3 slow steps forward and stretched her neck out and touched her nose briefly to Mabel's shoulder. Mabel stood absolutely still. Della pulled back, considered, stepped forward again. This time she kept her nose there for perhaps 10 seconds, and Mabel could feel the warmth of the horse's breath through her sleeve, steady and careful, the horse breathing her in. She did not move, did not reach up to touch, just let the contact be what it was. When Della stepped back on her own, Mabel walked calmly out of the paddock and across the yard and sat down on the porch step and pressed both hands flat on her knees and breathed, and the breathing had something caught in it that she was not going to cry about. Colt came around the side of the barn and saw her on the step. "She touched you," he said. He had been watching. "She did." I was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to get near that horse for 6 weeks," he said. There was nothing accusatory in it, more like a man noting an observation that has restructured something. "You've been trying," Mabel said. "That's the difference." He sat down on the step beside her, not close, leaving a gap, respectful of a space he wasn't sure he'd been invited into. "How do you know when to try and when to just be there?" "You watch what they do instead of what you want them to do," she said. "Most people, when they want something from an animal or from a person, they keep pushing because stopping feels like giving up. But sometimes stopping is the thing that opens the door." Colt rested his elbows on his knees and looked out at the paddock where Della had returned to her spot at the fence. "My wife used to say something like that," he said. The sentence came out the way things come out when they've been behind a door for a long time and find a crack. Sudden, surprising even to the person who said it. He went very still afterward, as if expecting it to cost him something. Mabel did not react with the kind of immediate sympathy that makes people close back up. She just said quietly, "What was her name?" A long pause. "Clara." "When?" 4 years ago." He was looking at his hands now. 4 years and a few months. She waited to see if he would continue. He didn't, not right away. So she sat with him in the silence, and the afternoon moved around them, and after a while he said, still looking at his hands, "I don't talk about it." "I know," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Another pause. "That's not what I meant." She looked at him. "I was working through something with the specific internal effort of a man who has been carrying something alone so long that putting it down, even briefly, even partially, requires a kind of muscular, unfamiliar effort. There were children," he said. 2. A girl 7 and a boy who was almost 5. He stopped. Mabel did not say "I'm sorry" because "I'm sorry" was too small for it, and they both knew it. She said, "What were their names?" He looked at her. Something in the directness of the question, its refusal to treat the children as an abstract tragedy, moved through his face in a complicated way. "Alice," he said, "and James." "Alice and James," Mabel repeated, giving the names their full weight. "They were real." "Yes. And you keep them real by not pretending they weren't." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It had the quality of something spoken from deeper in, unguarded in a way she suspected he rarely allowed. "A man named Silas Crow killed them," he said, "to stop me from hunting the gang he ran. I'd been tracking them for almost a year, getting close. He found out who I was, where I lived, and—" He stopped, started again. "I was 2 days right away when it happened. I came back and the house was burned, and they were gone." The sun was moving. A hawk turned slow circles over the far end of the paddock. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and stamped. "And Silas Crow," Mabel said, "still out there." His voice had gone flat. Not cold, but controlled, the way a very hot thing goes controlled behind the right kind of container. "Has been for 4 years. I stopped hunting him because after Clara and the children, I didn't trust what I'd do when I found him. And I've stayed stopped." He paused. "Some days." "Some days," she repeated. "It's not a proud thing to admit." "It's an honest thing," she said. "And honest is worth more than proud." He looked at her then, directly, the way he rarely did, holding it. "You say things," he said, that are simple and should be obvious and somehow aren't." "I've had time to think," she said. "Not much else to do in 14 months alone." She said it without self-pity, just as information. "You're not alone now," he said. It came out differently than he seemed to intend. He heard it himself, the slight overweight of it, and looked away quickly, and she let him look away without remarking on it. "No," she agreed. "Not right now." The third week, 2 things happened. The first was that Della let Mabel touch her neck. Not the leg. Mabel hadn't attempted the leg, would not attempt it until the mare offered an opening. But the neck, the solid muscled curve of it just below the jaw. Mabel's hand resting there while Della stood with her eyes half closed and her breathing slow, and something in her posture that was the hoarse equivalent of a long exhale. Colt watched from the fence. He didn't say anything afterward, but that evening at supper, he put an extra portion of the rabbit stew on her plate without asking, and she said nothing about it, and neither of them acknowledged that it had happened. The second thing was a rider from town. He came in the early afternoon on a horse that had been pushed harder than necessary, pulling up in the yard with the slightly theatrical flourish of a man who had been sent to deliver a message and wanted credit for the delivery. Mabel saw him from the kitchen window and watched Colt walk out from the barn to meet him. She couldn't hear the exchange. She watched the rider pass an envelope down from the saddle, watched Colt take it without breaking his expression, watched the rider leave at the same hard pace he'd arrived at. Colt stood in the yard with the envelope in his hand for a moment before he came back inside. He put it on the kitchen table in front of her without explanation. She looked at him. He nodded. She opened it. It was from Hector Langley. Not written by him, she could tell. The handwriting was too careful and formal, probably a lawyer or a clerk. And it was addressed to Colt. It said, in language that was polished and neutral and precisely calibrated to be both a threat and not legally a threat, that the Langley family was aware of the current situation and found it concerning, and that they hoped Mr. Maddox would reflect carefully on the wisdom of involving himself in matters that did not concern him, and that they wished him well in his endeavors. And then, at the bottom, a handwritten postscript in different, looser writing. Garrett's, she thought, though she'd never seen his hand. The Harper woman is a thief and worse. Whatever she's told you is a lie. She should be returned to town to face what she owes. Mabel set the letter down on the table. He's not going to let it go, she said. No, Colt agreed. I told you this would cause you trouble. You did. He pulled the letter off the table and folded it twice and put it in his shirt pocket. And I said he could try. Colt. She said his name plainly, without softening. I need you to understand that I'm not worth a war with Hector Langley. Something shifted in his jaw. Not anger, more like a man who has been told something he finds fundamentally incorrect and is working out how to say so without being dismissive. That's not your call, he said. It absolutely is my... I mean, he said more carefully, that worth isn't something you get to assign to yourself alone. Other people have a say. He looked at her. I have a say. She opened her mouth, closed it. Besides, he said, and the flatness in his voice had eased slightly, I don't much care for being told by Hector Langley what's wise for me to do. Never did like the man. This is not about liking him. No, Colt agreed. It's about the fact that his boy put 4 men to work beating a woman in the street and called it justice. And I watched it happen, and if I rode you back to town to face what you owe, I'd be saying, with my actions, that what happened in that street was acceptable. He paused. It's not. So he can write me all the letters he wants. She looked at him for a long moment. His face was steady, certain in the particular way of a man who has made a decision that runs all the way to the bottom of him. You're stubborn, she said. Have been, he agreed. It's going to make things hard. Most things worth keeping do. She picked up the supper things and started clearing the table, and the letter stayed in his pocket, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. But she lay awake on the cot in the small bedroom and listened to the prairie quiet, and felt the ranch around her. The barn, the paddock where Della stood in the dark, the kitchen still warm from the stove, and she thought about what it meant to be in a place where someone had decided, without caveat, that you were worth defending. It was not comfortable exactly. It was new in a way that required adjustment. It was the opposite of standing alone in the street with a basket of bread she'd baked at 4:30 in the morning while the town decided what she deserved. She pressed her hand against her ribs, which had become almost bearable now, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about Clara and Alice and James, whose names Colt carried like stones in deep water, and about Silas Crow still somewhere out there in the territory doing whatever Silas Crow did when no one was hunting him. She thought about how a man could carry a grief that large and still walk out to the paddock every morning and keep the barn in good repair and put food on the table and ride into town for supplies. How that particular kind of living took a courage that didn't have a name for itself. She thought, this is a man who has not stopped, who could have several times and didn't. And she thought, that is worth something. That is worth a great deal. Outside the window, the night was clear and full of stars, and Della moved once at the far end of the paddock, a dark shape shifting in darker dark, and somewhere far away a coyote said something to the empty land, and the land, as always, said nothing back. Mabel closed her eyes and slept, and this time the sleep came easier. It came because for the first time in 14 months, she had fallen asleep in a place that had not yet decided it didn't want her. That was enough. For tonight, that was genuinely enough. The letter from Hector Langley sat in Colt's shirt pocket for 3 days before he burned it in the stove, and neither of them mentioned it again, but its presence had changed something in the texture of daily life on the ranch. A low-grade alertness, the way the air changes before a storm that isn't visible yet, but is absolutely coming. Mabel noticed it in the way Colt started checking the rifle each evening before he came in for supper. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. He'd simply sit on the porch with it across his knees for 10 minutes and run through it with the particular thoroughness of a man who had learned the hard way that thoroughness was the difference between options and none. She noticed it in how he'd pause sometimes at the barn door and look down the road that connected the ranch to the main trail. Just look, for a moment, before going about whatever he'd been doing. She didn't ask him about it directly. She understood it. She'd started doing her own version of it, checking that the kitchen shutters latched properly, noting where the thickest walls were, the kind of instinctive inventory a person takes when they know trouble has their address. What she did not do was let it stop the daily work, because stopping the daily work was what trouble wanted. Della was the evidence of this. 4 weeks in, the mare had let Mabel rest a hand on her injured foreleg for the first time. Not manipulating it, not examining it with any purpose, just the weight of a hand, present and still. Saying, here, this is not something to be afraid of. Della had trembled, had started to pull away twice and stopped both times, had stood, finally, with her head turned to watch Mabel's face with one dark eye, deciding something. Colt had watched from outside the paddock fence and said nothing, which was exactly correct. Afterward, he said, how long before she'll work again? Depends on what you want from her, Mabel said. If you want her back to what she was, another month maybe. If you want her better than what she was, longer. What's the difference? What she was good because no one had ever pushed her past her trust. What she'll be when she's through this. Mabel looked at the mare, who had moved to the water trough, and was drinking with the slow deliberateness of an animal newly comfortable. She'll be good because she's been pushed past it and come back. That's a different kind of good. Colt was quiet for a moment. Is it better? Depends what you need it for, Mabel said. But I think yes. He nodded slowly, turning that over. Then, you're talking about the horse. Mostly, Mabel said, and went inside. Well, the fourth week she taught herself the ranch. Not because Colt asked her to, he hadn't, in any formal sense, and she suspected the formal sense was not his native language, but because knowing a place felt like the most basic form of belonging to it, and she had decided quietly and without ceremony that she was going to belong to this ranch for as long as it would have her. She walked the fence lines when her ribs finally permitted real walking, which they did by the 22nd day in increments that still required her to stop twice and breathe carefully through the worst of the incline near the north pasture. She mapped where the water ran in the creek to the west and where it would run off in heavy rain. She found the root cellar behind the barn that Colt had mentioned in passing and discovered it held 3 winter squash and a preserved ham from last fall, and a collection of mismatched glass jars that had once held various things and now held only potential. She stood in the root cellar for a moment, looking at those jars, thinking about potential. She was 34 years into her life. No, she was 26. She kept doing that, kept adding years to herself in her head, as though the last 14 months had cost more than they should have. And she was standing in a root cellar on a ranch 6 miles from a town that had watched 4 men beat her and done nothing. And she had broken ribs that were nearly healed and a knife cut above her cheekbone that had closed to a thin pink line. And she was, by any reasonable measure, in a precarious situation. And yet the squash were solid and the ham was good and the jars were clean and Della had let her touch the injured leg. And the kitchen was organized in a way that made sense now. And Colt came in for supper every evening and sat across from her and talked. Not much, but genuinely, the way a person talks when they're not performing conversation, but actually having one. She realized, standing in a root cellar being cautiously glad about her life, which struck her as both absurd and completely correct. She brought the squash inside and made a soup. The conversation that changed the shape of things happened on a Thursday evening, the kind of plain late summer evening that had no particular drama to it except the quality of the light, which was long and gold and fell through the kitchen window across the table where they were finishing supper. Silas Crow, Mabel said. Colt went still across the table. Not tensed, stilled, which is different, the way a man goes still when a thing he's been not thinking about gets said aloud. What about him, he said. Flat, even. You said you stopped hunting him, after Clara and the children. I said that. You also said some days. He looked at her. His jaw was set in the particular way it went when he was deciding how much of a thing to say. Some days I think about riding out, he said carefully. Looking for him, finishing what I started 4 years ago. And some days you don't. Some days I don't. He set his fork down. The days I don't are the days I'm thinking clearly enough to know that riding out to find Silas Crow alone is how a man gets dead, and that dying angry doesn't settle anything. But you think about it. Every morning, he said, first thing, before I'm fully awake, just for a minute, then I get up and do the work. She absorbed this. Outside, an early cricket had started up somewhere near the porch, ambitious in the cooling air. Is he still in the territory? She asked. I don't know exactly where he is, Colt said. Last I heard, his outfit was working the canyon south of the Bitterroot Range. That was 8 months ago. People move. He paused. He moves. Has he ever come looking for you? The silence that followed was longer than the question seemed to require. Once, Colt said, about a year after. Sent 2 men. They didn't find me. He paused again. I found them first. She didn't ask what happened to them. His face told her. So he knows you're still out here, she said. He knows. Colt looked at the table, at his hands. And now he knows I've got... He stopped, started again. He'll hear about Black Ridge eventually, about the Langley business. Silas Crow pays people to carry news. It's how he operates. Information is how he stays one move ahead. And he'll hear that you're not alone anymore, Mabel said quietly. Colt looked at her. There was something in his eyes that was complicated and direct at the same time. Awareness, and underneath it, an older layer of pain that recognized the specific shape of what they were discussing. Yes, he said. Because the last time you weren't alone, Mabel said, that was the lever he used. Yes. The cricket outside had been joined by several more. The light was going amber red. Colt's face in that light looked older than 34, and younger too, both at once. The way faces look when a person is telling a truth they've been keeping to themselves. I should have told you that before, he said, before you agreed to stay. You didn't know we'd be... She gestured at the table, the kitchen, the arrangement of two people sharing the same space regularly. This. No. He looked at her steadily. But I know it now. And it changes what the risk looks like. She held his gaze. Do you want me to leave? No. The word came out before the pause that should have preceded it, and he heard that and didn't walk it back. No, that's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? That you deserve to know what you're in, he said, so you can make a real choice, not just an I had nowhere else to go choice. She thought about that for a moment. About the morning in Black Ridge, the basket, the bread, Garrett's face when she'd said no, the way the crowd had stood and watched. She thought about the house she hadn't looked back at. I made a real choice, she said. I made it the day I came here. She paused. I'll make it again now, if that's what's needed. I'm staying. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his fork and went back to eating, and she went back to eating, and the crickets went on outside, and neither of them said anything else about it, because the thing had been said and heard, and that was enough. 3 days later, Colt began teaching her to shoot. He brought it up the way he brought most things up, directly, without preamble, early in the morning before the heat came. I want to show you the rifle today, he said. How to load it, how to hold it, how to aim. She looked at him across the coffee cups. Because of Silas Crow. Because of any number of things, he said. Because you're on a ranch 6 miles from town, and I can't always be within earshot, and knowing how is better than not knowing how. She didn't argue the logic of it. All right. He took her out behind the barn, away from the paddock where the sound would unsettle Della, and set up a row of tin cans on the top rail of the old fence that marked the south pasture boundary. He handed her the rifle with the specific care of a man who takes these things seriously, checking first that it was unloaded, showing her the mechanism, explaining each piece with the patience of someone who has no investment in how quickly she learns, only in whether she learns it right. It's going to kick, he said. I know what a rifle does. You know, in theory, the first time it happens is different from knowing it. He stood beside her, not behind her, close enough to correct but not so close as to be managing. Hold here. Firm but not tense. Tense makes you slow. She raised the rifle, her shoulder still occasionally producing echoes of the old rib pain when she reached wrong, tightened slightly. She settled it. Stock against your cheekbone, he said. Not your jaw, your cheekbone. She adjusted, looked down the barrel at the tin can 20 yards out. Breathe, he said. Steady breath. You shoot between breaths, not during. She breathed in, breathed out. In the stillness between exhale and inhale, she squeezed the trigger. The shot went 3 inches left of the can. Again, Colt said, and handed her another round. She reloaded the way he'd shown her. Slow, deliberate, not rushing. Raised the rifle, settled the stock, found the breath. The second shot clipped the edge of the can and sent it spinning off the rail. She lowered the rifle. Her shoulder was complaining about the recoil, but it was a manageable complaint. Good, Colt said. I missed the first one. Everyone misses the first one. Some people miss the first 50. He set a new can on the rail. Again. She missed 2 more before she hit the third clean, the tin jumping back and off the rail with a satisfying report that she felt in her chest as much as heard. Your eye is good, Colt said. You track naturally. I've always been able to see small things at distance, she said. Used to drive Thomas crazy. He'd miss a bird on the fence, and I'd tell him it was the way he was breathing. Was he? Always. She reloaded. He'd hold his breath to concentrate, which just made his hands shake. They worked for 2 hours. By the end, she was hitting the cans reliably at 20 yards and making contact, though not always clean contact, at 40. Colt said nothing that was praise exactly. He wasn't built for open praise. She'd learned that. But when he took the rifle back, he checked the barrel with a particular quality of attention that she understood was its own acknowledgement. They worked at it every morning for the following week. She got better faster than either of them announced, though both of them noticed. What she noticed also was that Colt was teaching her more than the rifle. He taught her how to bar the heavy interior shutters on the windows quickly, how they dropped into the iron brackets without the noise that came from doing it wrong. He showed her which section of the root cellar floor was wood, over a small earthen hollow, big enough for a person to pull a trapdoor down over themselves. He explained, matter-of-factly, where the spare ammunition was kept and why it was kept there and not somewhere more obvious. He taught her these things the way he taught her everything, without drama, without the weight of what they implied landing on top of the instruction, just practical information, just what you needed to know. But she heard what was underneath it. This might happen. This is not a maybe someday. This is a when. The when arrived on a Tuesday night, 6 weeks after Mabel had ridden out of Black Ridge on Colt's horse with everything she owned in a canvas bag. She knew before she fully woke up that something was wrong. Not a sound. Not yet. More a quality of the silence, the way it had changed texture, gone from the ordinary night quiet of crickets and horse breath, and the creak of the house settling into something that had a held breath quality. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but waiting. She was off the cot, and at the window before she'd made a conscious decision to be there, staying to the side of the frame the way Colt had shown her, looking out through the narrow gap at the edge of the shutter. The yard was moonlit, pale and still. Della was at the far end of the paddock, with her head up and her ears forward. Not the casual forward of curiosity, but the rigid maximum extension forward of an animal that has detected something and is doing the math on how bad it is. Then she heard it. A horse. More than one. Moving slowly up the trail from the south, the particular pace of men who are not trying to arrive openly. She was across the room and into the hall before the sound had fully registered. Colt's door was already open. He was already up, already dressed. She suspected he had not slept deeply in some nights. And he had the rifle in his hand and was moving toward the front window with that unhurried purpose she'd come to recognize as his particular brand of controlled urgency. "How many?" she said quietly. He held up a hand, listening. Through the walls of the house came the muffled sound of horses stopping in the yard. Then a voice, male, unhurried, projecting across the distance with the studied calm of a man who has done this before and found it effective. "Maddox." The voice carried easily, which meant the man had good lungs or had simply learned that shouting was less impressive than projection. "Colt Maddox. You know who this is?" Colt's jaw tightened in the dark. He did know. "Silas Crow," Mabel said. Not a question. He nodded. 4 years. The name she'd heard him say to the ceiling of the kitchen, essentially, every morning first thing before he was fully awake. The man responsible for Clara and Alice and James, the names he'd given her in the late afternoon light while the hawk turned circles over the paddock. Here, in the yard. "You've got 20 minutes, Silas Crow's voice said pleasantly. "Come out. You and I have a conversation, or we skip the conversation and get to the rest of it." A pause. "Your choice, naturally." Colt looked at Mabel. His face in the dark was unreadable in the specific way of a person controlling something very large from the inside. "Get the secondary rifle," he said. "Root cellar ammunition. Stay low at the east window." "I'm not going to the root cellar." "I didn't say root cellar. I said east window." She went. The secondary rifle was where he'd told her it would be, on the hooks beside the kitchen door, fully loaded because he'd been keeping it fully loaded for 3 days, she realized now, meaning he'd known or suspected this was coming. She checked it the way he'd taught her, the action of a woman who no longer thought about the checking, just did it, and moved to the east window, staying at the frame edge, looking out. 3 riders in the yard. She could see that much from the east angle. There might be more around the sides, probably were, if Silas Crow was as careful as Colt's descriptions had suggested. "You don't have to do this the hard way," Silas said from outside. The voice was almost conversational, which was worse somehow than anger would have been. "I've got no quarrel with you specifically, Maddox. My quarrel with you ended 4 years ago when you stopped being a problem. I'm just here to make sure you stay stopped." Colt's voice came from the front of the house, through the wall. "By doing what exactly?" A pause. The pause of a man who finds the question amusing. "By reminding you what you stand to lose," Silas said. Same reminder as before. Worked then. The implication of that, same reminder as before, landed in the house like a stone dropped in still water, and Mabel felt it reach her in the east window, and she understood in one clarifying instant exactly what it meant and what it was designed to do. It was designed to make Colt look at her and understand that she was the new lever. Clara and the children had been the lever 4 years ago. She was the lever now. From the front of the house, she heard Colt's voice, steadier than it had any right to be. "You made a mistake coming here." "Did I?" Silas said it without the inflection of a question. "You came with 3 riders. You knocked on the door and talked first, which means you don't actually want to fight tonight. You want me scared." Colt's voice was almost conversational now, too. "So you haven't won anything yet." A longer pause this time. "Burn the barn," Silas said. Mabel heard it happen. The footsteps, the movement around the side of the house, the specific sound of something being struck against the barn's west wall. She was already moving before the first orange light appeared at the corner of the east window, already at the kitchen door, already calculating. "Mabel," Colt's voice from the hall, sharp. "The horses are in the barn," she said. "I know. Don't—" "I'm not going to the barn," she said. "I'm covering the east approach because whoever they sent to the barn is coming from the east." A beat. She heard him hear the logic of, "2 shots if you need me," he said. "1 if I need you," she said. "2 means I'm already down." She heard something in the silence that followed, something that was not quite fear and not quite respect but contained both. And then he went back to the front. She pressed herself to the east wall beside the window and looked out through the gap. The man coming from the barn direction was moving fast, head down, and he was between her and the barn. She could see the fire starting, small yet, catching in the dry wood of the west wall, hungry in the way fire is always hungry when it finds good timber. She tracked the running man with the rifle. He was angling toward the house's east side, where the root cellar door sat in the ground. She understood it immediately. They'd been told there might be a cellar. They were going to cut off any hiding place. She said, loudly enough to carry, "So you are." He stopped, looked at the window, saw the rifle. "Back to your horse," she said. "Right now." In the front of the house, a shot. Then 2 more. The sound of horses in the yard moving. A shout. Another shot. The man at the east side held for 1 moment, calculating. She could see him calculating. And then he ran. Back toward the trees, not toward the house. She let him go because she had not shot anyone before and did not want to start with a man who was retreating, and because Colt needed to know the east side was clear. She moved to the hallway. "East is clear," she called. "Front's going," Colt called back. "They're pulling back, but the barn's fully—" He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need him to. She went to the front window. In the yard, 2 riderless horses milling, one of Silas's men on the ground but moving, trying to get up, the other already retreating up the trail. In the barn, the fire had gone from small and hungry to committed, the kind of fire that has made up its mind. The horses. She thought it before she decided it, already moving toward the back door. "The horses are tied," she said. "Mabel, I can reach the barn door from the blind side of the fire," she said. "Cover the yard." "Mabel, don't—" She was already out. The heat reached her 10 feet from the barn, a wall of it, not physical contact yet, but the immediate promise. She went around the east side, the side the fire hadn't reached, and found the barn door and got both hands on the bar and threw it up and pulled. The door swung open and the horses, smarter than any argument she could have made, bolted past her and out into the paddock night, all 4 of them at once. And the last one, Colt's gray, the one she'd ridden from Black Ridge, knocked her sideways with his shoulder as he went, and she went down on 1 knee in the dirt. She got up. The barn was fully involved now, heat and light rolling out the door, and she moved away from it at a fast walk that wanted to be a run but managed not to be, keeping herself upright, getting back to the blind angle of the house, getting back to the kitchen door. Colt was on the porch when she came around. He grabbed her arm, not roughly, but with the grip of a man checking that a thing is real, and looked at her face, her hands, looking for burns. "I'm all right," she said. "You're not?" he started. "I'm all right," she said again, steadier. "The horses are out." "How many got away?" He released her arm. His face in the firelight was a thing she didn't have a clean name for. "2 rode out. 1's down in the yard." He paused. "Silas wasn't with them. He sent riders." "He sent riders to tell you he knows where you are," Mabel said, "and to see what you'd do." "Yes." The barn was burning. She could feel it from 30 feet away, the kind of heat that you couldn't look directly at. 2 months of hay. The equipment. The structure Colt had maintained better than his own house because horses needed it more. She stood beside him and they both looked at it, and neither of them said anything about it burning because there was nothing useful to say. "The man in the yard," she said after a while. "Knocked off his horse. Not dead." He paused. "His choice what happens next depends on what he tells me." "And Della?" They both looked toward the paddock. In the far corner, away from the firelight, the dark bay mare stood, head up, ears full forward, alive. Mabel let out a breath she'd been holding since the barn door. "She's all right," Colt said quietly. "Yes." Mabel looked at the burning barn, at the yard, where the evidence of the night lay scattered, at the house, which stood, which was still standing. "He wanted us scared," she said. "I know. Did it work?" He looked at her. The fire threw light across his face, and she could see the answer moving through him, anger and grief, which was the anger's source, and underneath those something else, something harder to name. Resolution, maybe. Or the thing that comes after you've been scared and found that scared isn't the last word. "Not the way he intended," Colt said. She nodded. Around them the prairie held its silence and the barn held its fire, and the man in the yard had stopped trying to get up and was just lying there waiting to see what came next. And the horses moved restlessly in the dark at the edge of the paddock light, and somewhere up the trail Silas Crow's riders were reporting back to a man who had not come himself because he did not need to come himself to make his point. He had made his point. They had heard it. They were still standing. "We need to move," Colt said. He said it quietly, practically. "Tonight. He'll send more next time, and he'll come himself, and he'll come with enough men that holding the house won't work." "Iron Creek?" she said. Iron Creek was the nearest town with a proper marshal, 14 miles east, big enough to have law with real teeth. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, the recognition of a woman who had already been thinking the same thing, who had gotten there without being walked through it. "Iron Creek," he said. She went inside and began packing what mattered. She did not take long. She had already learned once what a person genuinely needed when the rest of it burns. She took the sewing kit in its wooden box, the almanac, the photograph, 2 boxes of rifle ammunition that she put at the bottom of the bag before anything else. She came back out to find Colt had caught Della and 2 of the other horses and was saddling them by the light of the burning barn, which gave the work a surreal, theater-lit quality she did not examine too closely. The man in the yard had managed to sit up. He was holding his arm against his chest, dislocated shoulder, she thought, from the fall, and watching Colt saddle horses with the expression of a man who has recalculated his situation and is not pleased with the result. "You're going to let me go?" he said. "I'm going to leave you here," Colt said, not unkindly, which is the same thing in practical terms. "Can you ride?" "Eventually." "Then eventually you ride back to Crow and you tell him something from me." The man waited. "Tell him I'm done being stopped," Colt said. "Tell him I stopped because I thought I was protecting something by staying still. Tell him I understand now that staying still just means he gets to choose when and where." He cinched the saddle. "Tell him I'm coming for him through the law, not around it, and tell him that's worse for him than the other way." He helped Mabel mount. She hadn't asked for help, but her shoulder was aching from the barn door and she accepted it. And they rode east into the dark, the light of the burning barn at their backs getting smaller, the prairie opening ahead of them, wide and indifferent, and full of the kind of distance that either swallows you or carries you, depending entirely on which direction you're pointed. She did not look back at the burning barn. She thought about how this was the second time she'd left something without looking back, and how different it felt this time. Not like running, not like being pushed out, like moving towards something instead of away from it. The difference was the rider beside her, which was not a small thing, and the rifle across her saddle, and the knowledge that she had been in the barn, had been at the east window, had been in this fight in a way that was not just surviving it, but participating in it. She was still afraid. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. Fear was not gone, was not a thing you ran out of, was just one of the conditions you worked within. She rode east through the prairie dark, beside a man who had told Silas Crow he was done being stopped, and the stars were very bright and very many, and the burned barn was behind them, and Iron Creek was 14 miles ahead, and she rode. They rode through what remained of the night and into the first gray hour of morning, and by the time the lights of Iron Creek appeared on the eastern horizon, Colt had gone quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. Mabel noticed it around the 4th mile. His breathing had changed, not dramatically, nothing that announced itself, But she had spent 6 weeks learning the particular rhythms of a man who did not communicate much in words, and therefore communicated everything else in how he sat a horse, how he held his shoulders, how his silences differed from each other. This silence had an effortful quality, the silence of a man maintaining something that required maintenance. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're spending energy on being upright that you should be spending on riding." A pause. "Left side. One of Crow's men got a shot off when they were pulling back. It's not deep." "How not deep?" "Deep enough to be inconvenient, not deep enough to stop." He said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who has been shot before and has a working system for categorizing it. She pulled her horse closer and looked at him in the gray pre-dawn light. The left side of his coat had a darkness to it that wasn't shadow. "Why didn't you say something?" "Because saying something wouldn't have changed the situation, and we needed to move." "It changes how fast we move," she said. "It changes whether you're going to fall off that horse before we reach Iron Creek." "I'm not going to fall off the horse." "That's what people say before they fall off the horse." She kept her voice even, practical, not panic, because panic didn't help either of them, but firm in the way of someone who has identified a problem and intends to address it. "How far?" 3 miles, maybe less." "Can you stay up 3 miles?" "Yes." "Tell me if that changes." He didn't answer, which she took as agreement. She positioned herself slightly ahead and to his left for the remaining distance, where she could see him without being obvious about watching, and she measured the 3 miles in the rhythm of his breathing and the set of his shoulders and the way his hands held the reins. And she was deeply relieved when the first buildings of Iron Creek resolved from shapes into actual structures in the early morning light. Iron Creek was not a beautiful town, but it was a real one, which was what mattered. It had a proper main street with a hotel, a doctor's office, not a man doubling as doctor and barber, but an actual physician, a woman named Dr. Adeline Marsh, who had come west from St. Louis 8 years ago and had, by all accounts, never once considered going back. A land office, a courthouse, and a marshal's office with iron bars on the windows that looked like they'd been put there by someone who understood what they were for. They came in on the eastern approach at just past sunrise, which meant the town was awake enough to notice 2 riders coming in tired, and one of them listing left, and the hotel keeper's boy who was sweeping the front steps stopped sweeping and stared until Mabel gave him a look that sent him inside. She got Colt to Dr. Marsh's office first, before the marshal, because priorities were priorities. She knocked hard enough that the sound carried, and Dr. Marsh, a compact woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pulled severely back, and the eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by what came through her door years ago, opened it within 2 minutes, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and stepped aside to let them in. "Gunshot?" she said. "Left side 6 hours ago," Mabel said. "He's been riding 6 hours with a gunshot wound," Dr. Marsh said. This was not a question. "We didn't have an alternative." "No, I can see that." She was already moving Colt toward the examining table, and he was letting her, which told Mabel more about the actual state of him than anything he'd said on the trail. Colt did not let people move him places without argument when he had the energy to argue. "You his wife?" "No," Mabel said. "Then wait outside." "I'll wait inside," Mabel said. Dr. Marsh looked at her, a quick, measuring look, the look of a woman who spends her days making rapid assessments of people. Whatever she found in Mabel's expression, she nodded once and turned back to Colt without further discussion. The wound was a through and through on the lower left side. The bullet had passed clean, which was the best possible version of being shot, Dr. Marsh explained, while Colt sat on the examining table with his jaw set and looked at the wall. It had nicked something that would take time to heal properly and had lost more blood than was ideal but was not, she said, with the precise confidence of someone who knew exactly where the line was, life-threatening. "You need rest," she told Colt. "I need 2 days," he said. "You need a week." "2 days," he said again, "and then I need to move." Dr. Marsh looked at Mabel. Mabel shrugged slightly, which was honest. She had already learned that arguing Colt out of a position that ran all the way to the bottom of him was not a productive use of anyone's time. 2 days minimum, Dr. Marsh said. "You reopen that wound riding hard before it's closed properly, you'll be back here in a box." She paused. "That's not rhetorical. That's medicine." 2 days, Colt agreed. "Then we'll see." She cleaned and packed and closed the wound with the brisk efficiency of a woman who did not waste motion, and when she was done, she turned to Mabel and said, "He needs to sleep, not sit up. Sleep. Can you make that happen?" "Probably not," Mabel said honestly, "but I can make staying awake inconvenient enough that sleep becomes attractive." Dr. Marsh almost smiled. "Hotel's across the street. Tell Hennessy I sent you. He'll give you the room with the good window." She looked at Mabel's face, the faded bruising, the closed cut above her cheekbone. "That's older," she said. 3 weeks. "Who closed it?" "Doc Heller, Black Ridge." "Heller's competent." She looked at Mabel a moment longer, reading the rest of it. The rifle across her saddle that she'd brought inside. The canvas bag with ammunition at the bottom. The particular quality of a woman who had been through something and come out the other side changed in ways that weren't all visible. "You can use my office to clean up if you need." "Thank you," Mabel said, and meant it. She got Colt to the hotel and into a bed, which took longer than it should have because he insisted on walking without help and managed it, barely, through the specific determination of a man who is not going to be carried through a hotel lobby. She let him have that. It cost him, but she let him have it. He was asleep before she'd finished pulling his boots off. She sat in the chair by the window for a while, watching him sleep, which was not something she'd done before. He was always up before her or working when she turned in, and found it told her things about him that the waking hours didn't. How young he looked when the maintenance dropped away. How the lines around his eyes and mouth, which in waking were the lines of a contained man, in sleep were just the lines of a man who had lived 34 years in hard country and felt most of them. She sat there until she was certain he was genuinely asleep and not merely resting, and then she went to the marshal's office. Marshal Dale Pruitt was a man in his early 60s, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of deliberate stillness that comes from having done a difficult job long enough to stop moving more than necessary. He had a full white mustache and eyes the color of weathered wood, and he listened to Mabel from behind his desk without interrupting, which she appreciated. She told him everything, not in order of drama, in order of usefulness. Who Silas Crow was, what he'd done 4 years ago, what he'd done last night, the man left in the yard with the dislocated shoulder who could be found at the Maddox Ranch site if the marshal sent someone before too many hours passed. The burned barn. The shots fired. The fact that Colt Maddox had been tracking Crow for nearly a year before Clara and the children were killed and had stopped afterward. And that stopping had apparently not convinced Crow that the threat was gone. Pruitt listened through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a pen in his hands. "Crow," he said. "Silas Crow. I know that name." "Most people in the territory do?" "He's been careful," Pruitt said. "Careful enough that nobody's had a clean legal case. Plenty of things people know he's done. Proving them in front of a judge is different." "Colt can give you witness testimony to the murders," Mabel said. "He wasn't present, but he was close enough behind that he saw the aftermath. And the men Crow sent to kill him afterward will be known to the marshal's circuit. 2 of them are dead." She paused. "Colt killed them in self-defense. I expect there's paperwork on it somewhere." "There might be." Pruitt set the pen down. "You're asking me to mount an expedition." "I'm asking you to do your job," Mabel said. Not rudely, plainly. Silas Crow killed a woman and 2 children to stop a man from hunting him. Last night he sent riders to burn a barn and deliver a message. The message is that he'll do it again, to people who have nothing to do with whatever he decides his interests are. She looked at Pruitt steadily. "That's what a marshal's office is supposed to address." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "You're not from around here." "I'm from Black Ridge, which is where Hector Langley's son beat me in the street for refusing his proposition, and no one stopped him." She kept her voice level. "I've had a complicated couple of months. What I've learned from them is that waiting for things to improve without doing anything to make them improve is just a way of deciding you're comfortable with them as they are." Another long pause. The marshal had the quality of a man who reached conclusions slowly and held them firmly once reached, which was probably what the job required. "Where's Maddox now?" he said. "Hotel, across the street. Dr. Marsh closed a gunshot wound an hour ago. He'll be up tomorrow morning arguing that he's fine." "Will he be fine?" "No," Mabel said, "but he'll be functional, which is different, and he knows Crow's territory better than anyone you have. He was tracking him for a year." She paused. "He'll want to come. I won't stop him. What I will do is make sure that when he comes, it's through your office and not around it. Pruitt looked at her. And why is that? Because going around it, Mabel said, is how you end up doing what Silas Crow did. And Colt Maddox is not that man, even if some mornings he's not sure. The marshal was quiet for a considerable time. Then he stood up, which with a man his size was its own form of statement. I'll send a deputy to the ranch site today. Get that man with the shoulder before he disappears. He moved to the door, held it. Come back this afternoon with Maddox's statement. Written, if he can manage it. Verbal, if he can't. He can manage it, Mabel said. All right. He looked at her. You said Black Ridge. You said Langley. Yes. Hector Langley's been overdue for someone saying no to him for about 15 years, Pruitt said, for what it's worth. It's worth something, Mabel said, and went back to the hotel. Colt's written statement took 3 hours to produce and cost him more than he showed, though the showing was considerable. He sat up in the hotel bed with paper on a book across his knees and wrote in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who did not write frequently, but who, when he wrote, meant every word. Mabel sat in the chair by the window and read it when he was done, because he handed it to her without being asked, and she took it without making a thing of the handing. It was precise and specific and completely without sentimentality. It described the year of tracking, the locations and dates where he'd confirmed Crow's outfit's activity, the names of 2 men he'd identified in the gang by their faces from earlier encounters, the timeline of what he'd found when he came home. It described Clara and Alice and James in one sentence, factual, complete. My wife, Clara Ann Maddox, age 29, and our children Alice, age 7, and James, age 4, were killed at the ranch property on the 9th of October 4 years prior, the method being fire, the cause being a deliberate act by or on the order of Silas Crow to prevent my continued investigation of his criminal enterprise. One sentence. She read it twice. This is good, she said. It's true, he said. That's what I mean. She set it down. How's the side? Manageable. On a scale of how you were this morning to how you were last night. Closer to this morning. He looked at her. He had color back, which was the difference sleep made, and the contained quality had returned to his face. But different from before, she thought. Slightly different. Something had shifted in the configuration of what he was containing. You went to the marshal before I was awake. I did. I would have gone. I know. I went while you were sleeping because you needed the sleep more than you needed to be the one who went. She held his gaze steadily. I told him what happened. I told him about Clara and the children. I told him we needed an organized expedition with legal authority rather than 2 people riding into Crow's Canyon territory alone. He was quiet for a moment. She waited for the argument. What did he say? Colt asked. He said he'd come back this afternoon with a statement. She nodded at the paper. Which you've done. Another pause. You told him what you told me, that going around the law is how you end up like Crow. Yes. And you believe that? I believe it for you, she said carefully. I think going around the law would cost you something that the revenge wouldn't give back. I think you know that too, on the days you're thinking clearly. He looked at the paper in her hands. 4 years, he said. That's a long time to know something and still want the other thing. Yes, she said. It is. If Pruitt mounts an expedition and we find Crow and I have him in front of me, I don't know what I'll do. He said it with the particular honesty of a man who has stopped pretending to know things he doesn't. I want you to know that. I can't promise you how that goes. I know, Mabel said. I'm not asking for a promise. I'm asking for the attempt. He took the statement back from her, looked at it once, folded it. All right, he said. They went to Pruitt's office that afternoon, Colt moving carefully with his left arm held slightly in, and the marshal took the statement and read it with the same slow thoroughness he'd applied to Mabel's account. And when he was done, he set it on his desk and said, I'm going to wire the territorial circuit judge. We need a warrant before we move on a canyon stronghold. That takes time. How much time? Colt said. 2, 3 days? Wire goes today, response comes back, paperwork gets filed. Pruitt looked at him. You're in no condition to ride hard for 2 or 3 days anyway, Maddox. I'll be the judge of that. Dr. Marsh already is the judge of that, Mabel said. Colt looked at her. She looked back. He looked at the wall. 2 days, he said to Pruitt. 2 days, if the wire comes back fast. I'll need to pull in 4 or 5 deputies. I know where to find 3 of them, and I'll send word for the other 2 today. He paused. You know the canyon approach. Well enough. Then I want you in front when we ride in, not shooting first. In front, identifying. He held Colt's gaze with the steady weight of a man who has done this long enough to know what he's looking at. That means staying alive until we get there. That means Dr. Marsh's instructions. Colt was quiet for a moment. Understood, he said, which was not quite yes and not quite no, but was the closest he was going to come. The 2 days that followed were the strangest Mabel had spent yet in what had become a reliably strange period of her life. Iron Creek was not Black Ridge. It was larger, older, less interested in its own small cruelties. No one on the main street gave her a second look, which she found so disorienting at first that she kept waiting for the other shoe to drop and eventually understood it wasn't going to. She was simply a woman moving through a town. That was all. The specific weight of being watched and found wanting, which she'd carried in Black Ridge so long she'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a stone in your boot, was simply absent here, and its absence felt both like relief and like the strange lightness of putting something down. You'd held so long, your arms had forgotten how to hang straight. She spent part of the first day at the dry goods store, restocking what the flight from the ranch had not allowed time to take. She spent another part of it in conversation with Dr. Marsh, who turned out to have opinions about frontier medicine and about difficult horses that were both more extensive and more interesting than Mabel had expected. Horses and people, Dr. Marsh said, over coffee in her small office. Same fundamental problem. They're in pain, and they've learned that showing it makes it worse, so they go somewhere inside where it doesn't show. And then they can't come back out easily, Mabel said. Some of them can't come back at all. Dr. Marsh looked at her coffee. The ones that can, it's usually because someone was patient enough to wait for them to decide. Mabel thought about Della standing at the far fence in the paddock dark, alive. Thought about Colt at the hotel bed, writing one careful sentence about Clara and Alice and James. How's your patient? She asked. Healing, Dr. Marsh said. Slowly, on purpose. A pause. He's a stubborn man. Yes. Good stubborn or bad stubborn? Mabel thought about it. He's stubborn about the things that don't matter and completely clear-eyed about the things that do, she said. I haven't decided if that's one kind or two. Dr. Marsh looked at her. How long have you known him? 7 weeks. And you rode into my office at sunrise with him bleeding and then went directly to the marshal and then sat in a hotel room making sure he slept. She said it without judgment, just reading the thing as it was. Yes, Mabel said. All right, Dr. Marsh said, and poured more coffee. Colt was better on the second day in ways that were visible and worse in ways that weren't. The wound was closing, which Dr. Marsh confirmed with a satisfaction that was professional rather than personal. What was not better was the specific quality of his stillness, which had changed again, had gone from the enforced stillness of a man recovering to the gathered stillness of a man getting ready for something. He spent most of that day on the hotel porch, and Mabel brought him food at intervals that she paced carefully, and he ate without commenting on the pacing, and they talked about what was coming the way you talk about weather, acknowledging it, working out the practical response, not pretending it wasn't there. Crow's Canyon, Colt said at one point. It's a natural fortification. One main approach from the south, steep walls on 3 sides. If he's got enough men and he's prepared, it's defensible. Then Pruitt needs to know that before he plans the approach. I'll tell him tonight. He paused. There's a secondary approach from the east, a creek bed. Crow doesn't use it because it takes half a day longer and involves a section where you have to walk the horses, but it comes out above the main camp on the ridge. Another pause. If Pruitt sends half his men around the east while the main group comes up the south, Crow loses the high ground. You've thought about this a lot, Mabel said. 4 years, he said. She nodded. Tell Pruitt tonight. All of it. Draw it if you need to. I'm not much for drawing. Draw it anyway. A bad map is better than no map. He did draw it. Badly, as promised, with the unselfconscious practicality of a man who is not going to let pride in his drawing stop a useful map from existing. He sat at the small table in Pruitt's office that evening, with Mabel beside him and 2 deputies leaning over the table from the other side. and he walked them through it in the flat, precise way he had of explaining things that mattered. The south approach, the canyon walls, the creek bed to the east, the approximate location of the main camp based on information 4 years old that was possibly outdated. Possibly outdated, Pruitt said. I haven't been there since before, Colt said. He may have moved camp within the canyon. The canyon itself hasn't moved. What's your read on how many men he runs? When I was tracking him, 8 to 12. Could be fewer now, could be more. Last night he sent 5, kept himself back. Pruitt looked at the map for a long time. The warrant came through this afternoon, he said. Wire from the circuit judge. We move tomorrow morning, early. Something moved through Colt's face, relief and its opposite at once, which is the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for 4 years and has just been told it will happen tomorrow. I'll be ready, he said. Dr. Marsh cleared you? Pruitt asked. A slight pause. She said I was healing. That's not what I asked. I'll be ready, Colt said again. Pruitt looked at Mabel, which was, she was beginning to understand, something he did when he wanted an honest answer to a question he already knew Colt would not give directly. He can ride, she said. He shouldn't, but he can, and you need him at the front. You're coming? Pruitt said to her. This was not a challenge, just information gathering. She hadn't decided until that moment with certainty. She thought about the ranch house, the east window, the running man she'd stopped with one sentence and a rifle. She thought about what Colt had said. I'm done being stopped. Yes, she said. Pruitt nodded. Can you shoot? Well enough, she said. Better than a week ago. He looked at her for a moment, then back at the map. All right. He stood. Sunrise tomorrow. All of you. Be here. They rode at first light, Pruitt and 4 deputies, Colt on his gray that had made it through the barn fire and been stabled at Iron Creek's livery, Mabel on the horse she'd had since the night of the fire, which had no name but had proven reliable in ways that were more important than names. 7 riders in the cool morning air, heading southwest toward the Bitterroot Canyon country. Colt set the pace, which told Mabel more about his actual physical state than anything he'd said. He kept it to a hard but not brutal pace, the pace of a man managing something carefully rather than the pace he'd choose if he were whole. She watched him from one position back and to his right, and he did not look at her but once, briefly, when they crossed the creek line that marked the last landmark before Crow's territory. She gave him a look that said, I'm here. He turned back to the trail. They found the canyon mouth in the late morning, and Pruitt split the group as Colt had mapped it. 2 deputies around the east through the creek bed, while the rest continued south. The separation was wordless, efficient, the deputies peeling off with the competence of men who had done this kind of work before and understood that talking about it was a way of not doing it. 5 of them on the south approach, Pruitt, Colt, Mabel, 2 deputies. The canyon walls rose on either side as they moved in, and the light changed quality, narrowed, and Mabel felt the specific compression of being in terrain that had been chosen by someone else for its defensibility. They found the first man 300 yards in, a lookout, posted on a rock shelf above the trail, who came to his feet when he saw them and went for his rifle and stopped when he understood the count. Federal warrant, Pruitt called up to him. Silas Crow. Step down and stay down. The man calculated. Made the right calculation, came down. The camp was another quarter-mile in, a collection of rough structures in the widened bowl of the canyon, 5 men visible initially, 2 more appearing at the sound of horses. No Crow, not immediately visible. Mabel scanned the structures, the angles, counting. He's here, Colt said quietly, not loud enough for the men ahead to hear. He had gone very still on his horse. He doesn't run. How do you know? Because running isn't who he is, Colt said. He'll have heard us coming and he'll be positioned somewhere he thinks is advantageous. The standoff that followed was 20 minutes that felt like 2 hours. Pruitt called Crow's name twice. Deputies took up positions. The camp's men, faced with a federal warrant and a marshal's badge and the arithmetic of the situation, came out one at a time and were told to sit in a line against the canyon wall. Silas Crow came out last. He was a smaller man than Mabel had expected, built compact and efficient, with a face that was unremarkable in almost every respect. Not mean-looking, not dramatically villainous, the face of a man who could walk through any town and be forgotten immediately after. He came out of the largest structure with his hands away from his body and looked across the camp at Pruitt with an expression of deliberate calm that Mabel suspected had been constructed over many years. His eyes found Colt. Something passed between the two men, 4 years of it, passing in about 3 seconds. Mabel watched Colt's face, which had gone absolutely still, the kind of still that is not peace but its opposite, compressed down to a single point. Maddox, Crow said, conversational, unsurprised. Should have finished this years ago. Yes, Colt said. His voice was flat and entirely level. You should have. Pruitt moved between them, not dramatically, just positioning, the marshal's instinct for geometry. Silas Crow. Federal warrant for murder, arson, conspiracy. He held the document up briefly. You're under arrest. Crow looked at the warrant, looked at the assembled deputies, looked at the men sitting against the canyon wall. He was doing the math in the thorough, efficient way Mabel imagined he did most things. All right, he said, quietly, with the specific quality of a man who is not defeated but is choosing to defer. Pruitt moved to cuff him, and in the moment that Crow's hands were being brought behind him, he looked past Pruitt directly at Colt, and he said, with something that was not quite a smile, 4 years and you came through the law. That's not you, Maddox. That's someone else's idea. Colt looked at him. His hand had gone to his holster. Not drawing, just the natural movement of a body that has been waiting 4 years for this moment and has its own opinions about it. Mabel was beside him before she had decided to move. Not in front. Beside, close, her hand coming to rest over his where it sat at the holster, not pulling it away, not forcing anything. Just present. The weight of a hand. He looked down at her hand, up at her face. He's right, Colt said. His voice was rough. Part of me wants, I know, she said quietly. I know what part of you wants. That part's been carrying this for 4 years and it's exhausted, and it wants to be done. She held his gaze. This is being done. Right now. Through Pruitt. Through the warrant. Through a courtroom where every single thing he did gets said out loud with a judge listening. She paused. Clara and Alice and James deserve that more than they deserve him dead in a canyon where it never gets recorded. He looked at her for a long moment. The hand under hers was shaking slightly. Not from the wound, she thought, but from the effort of the thing, the specific muscular effort of a man overriding 4 years of a particular intention. Then his hand moved. Not to the gun. Away from the gun. She stepped back and left him room. He looked at Crow, who had watched this exchange with that constructed calm, reading it, calculating what it meant for him. And he said, in a voice that had gone from rough to something very quiet and very certain, she's right. And you're going to stand in front of a judge and every single thing you did is going to be on record. The names of my children are going to be in the record. So are yours. Crow said nothing. Pruitt finished with the cuffs and straightened up and caught Mabel's eye briefly. Just briefly, a single nod. The acknowledgement of a man who has seen something handled correctly and recognizes it. And then he turned back to the business of arrest, which still had considerable logistics to it. Colt stood for a moment with his arms at his sides and looked at the canyon walls above them, the narrow slice of sky. His chest moved with a breath that seemed to go very deep. He looked at Mabel. She looked back at him. All right, he said, just that. All right, she agreed. Around them, the canyon held its strange acoustics, voices carrying in odd ways, deputies moving with the brisk purpose of men who had a long ride back ahead of them, and Silas Crow stood with his hands behind his back and looked at nothing in particular with the careful face of a man already calculating his next position. But the calculation was smaller now. The options were fewer. The law had its teeth in this and would not let go. It was not the ending Colt had imagined for 4 years. It was not clean, and it was not final in the way revenge promises to be final, which is a promise revenge never keeps anyway. It was real. It was the kind of real that held. Mabel turned her horse toward the canyon mouth, toward the south approach, and the open country beyond, and the long ride back to Iron Creek. She did not look back at the camp, or at Silas Crow, or at the canyon walls. She had been learning, these past weeks, what it looked like when you were done looking back. The ride back from the canyon took most of the afternoon, and nobody talked much. That was fine. There was a particular kind of quiet that follows the end of a long thing. Not peaceful exactly, more like the silence of a room after furniture has been rearranged. everything in new positions that the eye hasn't learned yet. Mabel rode slightly behind Colt and watched the set of his shoulders and understood that what was happening inside him was not simple and would not be simple for some time, and that this was correct. 4 years of a particular weight does not lift clean. It lifts in stages, and the first stage mostly feels like the absence of something you'd gotten used to carrying, which is its own strange disorientation. He hadn't spoken since the canyon. Not to her, not to Pruitt, not to the deputies. He rode and he looked at the country ahead, and he breathed carefully around the wound in his side, and she let him have all of that. Pruitt rode with Crow and the arrested men ahead of the main group, which she suspected was deliberate, giving Colt distance from the man, letting the arrest be a fact that settled rather than a presence that kept raw edges open. The marshal was more thoughtful than he looked, she had decided, which was probably useful in his line of work. It was late afternoon when Colt pulled his horse up beside her without warning, and she matched his pace, and they rode side by side for a while in the long amber light before he spoke. She would have hated this, he said. Mabel waited. Clara, he said. She'd have hated the way it went. The riding out, the armed men, all of it. She was... He paused, choosing words with care. She was someone who believed problems had solutions that didn't require guns. She was mostly right about that. Another pause. She would have found another way. Maybe, Mabel said. No, she would have. She was smarter than me about people. She could talk a man out of a position he'd held for 20 years in about 15 minutes. Something moved briefly across his face that was grief and tenderness and something close to humor, all at once. She talked me out of things regularly. What kinds of things? Stubbornness, mostly, he said. I come by it naturally. I'd noticed. He looked at her sideways. Was that a joke? A small one, she said. He was quiet again for a moment. I keep thinking I should feel something different than what I'm feeling, he said. I thought it would feel like finished, like a door closing. It doesn't feel like that. What does it feel like? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave most questions. Like the beginning of finished, he said finally. Like I can see the door from here, but I'm not through it yet. The trial, she said. Yes. The trial, the testimony, the sentence. He looked at the horizon. Months, probably, and I'll have to say the names again, in a courtroom, on record. I'll have to... He stopped. Yes, Mabel said. She didn't try to make it smaller. You will. I know. He straightened slightly in the saddle, the small physical adjustment of a man reorganizing himself. I know. He paused. Thank you for what you said. In the canyon. You did the hard part, she said. I just stood next to you. That's not nothing, he said. Believe me, that's not a small thing. She looked at the trail ahead, at the long country rolling out toward Iron Creek. I know, she said quietly. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from the earlier one. Easier, the way silence between two people gets easier when something true has been said and heard and doesn't need to be circled anymore. Silas Crow's trial was held 6 weeks later in Iron Creek, in the territorial courthouse that smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the specific gravity of official proceedings. It lasted 4 days. Mabel sat in the gallery for most of it. Colt testified on the second day, which was the day Mabel had been quietly dreading, not for the legal outcome, but for what it cost him to stand in front of a room full of strangers and say Clara's name, say Alice's name, say James's name, say the 9th of October and fire and evidence and aftermath. All the clinical language that the law required around events that were anything but clinical. He did it. He stood at the witness stand with his hat in his hands, and his wound fully healed now beneath his shirt, and he answered every question that the territorial prosecutor put to him with the same flat precision that characterized everything he said that he meant. He did not break down. He did not perform grief for the room. He simply told what happened with the specific authority of a man who was there and remembered everything and had thought about nothing else for 4 years. When the defense attorney, a man from out of territory who had been paid well and earned some of his fee, tried to suggest that Colt's long pursuit of Crow had been a personal vendetta that colored his testimony, Colt looked at him and said, "My wife and children are dead because of that man. You can call that a personal vendetta if you want to. I call it a reason." The room was quiet after that. Mabel, in the gallery, pressed her hands flat on her knees. On the fourth day, the jury was out for less than 2 hours. Silas Crowe was convicted on 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of arson, conspiracy, and 6 additional charges relating to the enterprise he'd been running through the Canyon Territory for the better part of a decade. The sentence was life, to be served at the territorial prison at Hartwell, which was a long way from the Bitterroot Canyon country and had walls that were exactly as thick as the architect had intended. Crowe received the sentence the way he'd received most things, with that constructed calm, reading the situation, calculating. There was nothing left to calculate now, which Mabel suspected he knew and had known since the canyon, but the face didn't change. Some men were their faces so completely that the face held even when everything else collapsed. She watched him be let out and felt nothing particularly dramatic. Not satisfaction, not relief, not the clean resolution she might have expected. Just the settled sense of a thing being where it belonged. The right outcome reached by the right process. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't supposed to be. She found Colt on the courthouse steps afterward, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, looking at the street. She sat down beside him. "It's done," she said. "Yes." He turned the hat in his hands once. "It's done." He was quiet for a moment. "Alice liked hats," he said, apparently randomly from somewhere internal that had opened a door she hadn't expected. She was 7, and she'd already decided she needed a hat with a ribbon on it, like the women in the catalog pictures. Clara was going to order one for her birthday. He stopped. It was 3 weeks before her birthday when it happened. Mabel said nothing. Let it be there. "I don't know why I told you that," he said. "Because it's true and you've been keeping it," she said. Because she was real and she was 7 and she wanted a hat, and that's worth saying out loud to someone who'll hear it. He looked at her. His eyes were dry, but the area around them was tight, with the specific tension of a man who has been maintaining something for a very long time and is reaching the outer limits of his capacity to maintain it. "I hear it," she said. He put his hat back on and looked at the street again, and they sat on the courthouse steps in the afternoon light. 2 people who had been through the same difficult months by different routes and arrived at the same courthouse steps, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was all right. They stayed in Iron Creek through the rest of that month. Colt's wound finished healing properly. Dr. Marsh signed off on it with the satisfied brevity of a physician whose instructions had finally been followed, and Mabel helped him arrange the legal paperwork for the ranch property, which was a more complicated process than it should have been, because the county records in the Black Ridge Circuit still listed the ranch under terms that Hector Langley had apparently been slowly rewriting through the local land office. This was the piece of business that led, indirectly, to the resolution of the other outstanding problem. Pruitt, when Mabel brought this to his attention, she'd found the discrepancy in the paperwork herself, reading carefully through the documents with the focused attention she gave anything that had numbers and implications, said that this was outside his jurisdiction specifically, but well within the jurisdiction of the Territorial Land Commissioner, to whom he would be happy to send a letter. The letter went. The Land Commissioner sent an inspector. The inspector went to Black Ridge and found that the modifications to the ranch's land records were not the only irregularities in the county land office, and that Hector Langley's name appeared, directly or indirectly, in a remarkable number of those irregularities, and that Garrett Langley's accusation of theft against Mabel Harper had been recorded in the public ledger in language that was factually incorrect and appeared to have been inserted by someone with access to official records and an interest in Mabel's good name not being good. None of this resolved quickly. These things don't. But they resolved. Hector Langley faced a territorial investigation into his land office dealings that lasted the better part of a year and resulted in financial penalties significant enough to remove permanently and without ceremony the comfortable assumption that the Langley name was protection from consequence. He did not go to prison. Men like Hector Langley rarely did. But the name stopped meaning what it had meant in Black Ridge, and the town that had watched in silence while his son beat a woman in the street found that silence costing more than it had before. Garrett Langley left Black Ridge 6 months after the investigation began. No announcement, no confrontation. He simply wasn't there one morning and didn't come back, which is how certain kinds of men leave, in the middle of the night, when staying requires courage they don't possess. The false entry in the public ledger was corrected. It was a small thing. administratively. A crossed-out line, a correction, a new record. It was not a small thing to Mabel. She held the corrected document in her hands in the land commissioner's temporary office in Iron Creek and looked at her name, which now appeared in the record as what it was, a woman who had paid for her goods and left, against whom no charge stood. The document was plain and bureaucratic and entirely without drama. She put it in the canvas bag next to the sewing kit and the almanac and the photograph. The land they bought was 20 miles northwest of Iron Creek, on the far side of a long hill that caught the morning light at an angle that turned the grass silver gold for about an hour each day, which was the thing that decided it. Colt had been looking at practical considerations: water access, soil quality, distance to the nearest town. And all of those were favorable, but it was Mabel who stood on the top of the hill on the day they rode out to look at it and watched the morning light move across the grass and said simply, "This one." He'd looked at her, looked at the land, looked at the hill and the light. "All right," he said. They built the house themselves, which was the hardest thing either of them had done that didn't involve being shot or beaten, and took most of the summer. They were not natural building partners. Mabel had strong structural opinions that Colt sometimes shared and sometimes didn't, and there were several days during the framing when the air between them had a quality that could charitably be described as productive tension, and less charitably described as a sustained argument conducted mostly in silences. The east wall of the main room became a point of specific contention. Mabel wanted a larger window than the one Colt had framed in. He said it weakened the wall. She said the wall was solid enough to accommodate a window that let in actual light. He said structural integrity was not negotiable. She said neither was spending the winter in a room that felt like a root cellar. They stared at each other across the half-framed wall for a considerable moment. "Bigger window," she said. "You know nothing about load-bearing. I know I'm going to be in that room every day of every winter, and it needs light," she said. "Put a proper lintel over it, and the load is managed. I've read enough of that almanac to know that much." He was quiet. "The almanac has a section on construction," she said. "I know about the almanac. I've seen you reading it since the first week you came to the ranch." "Then you know it's a good almanac." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "Bigger window," he said, and went to adjust the framing. The window was large enough that the morning light came through it in a long rectangle that reached the kitchen table by 8 o'clock and the main room floor by 9. And in the winter it would angle differently and stay shorter but stay longer into the afternoon, and neither of them said anything about having been right, because the window was clearly right, and that was enough. They were not a perfectly functioning household. They had friction the way any two people have friction when they're building something together from nothing. Friction over the way the barn was organized, over how much salt went in the cornbread, over Colt's habit of leaving his rifle on the porch rather than putting it away, which Mabel maintained was both careless and unnecessary, and Colt maintained was a matter of readiness that she did not fully appreciate. "We're 20 miles from anyone," she said. "Readiness for what?" "Anything," he said. "That is not a specific answer." "No," he agreed, and left the rifle on the porch. She moved it inside one evening when he was in the barn. He moved it back the next morning. She found this, after a week of it, more amusing than irritating, which was probably a sign of something, but she didn't examine it too closely. What she did examine, in the small quiet spaces of the days, was the accumulation of what this life was. Della had come with them to the new land. There had never been a question about that. Della was Colt's horse and Mabel's project, and had become, over the months since the first touch of a nose to a shoulder in a paddock, something that fit cleanly in neither category, and perhaps didn't need to. The mare worked now. Not dramatically, not with any special display. She was a working horse on a working ranch, which meant she did what was required, and did it without the fearful edge that had characterized her for the months after the fall. She would still, occasionally, on days when the wind came from the wrong direction or a sound surprised her, go briefly back to that earlier wariness, ears hard forward, eyes showing white at the rim. On those days, Mabel would stop whatever she was doing and go to the paddock and stand near her, not close, not touching, just present. The same way she'd stood in that first paddock in Black Ridge, doing nothing except being someone who was not a threat. Della always settled. It took longer some days than others. "She's not fixed," Colt said once, watching. "No," Mabel agreed. "She's not fixed. She's managing." She looked at the mare who had lowered her head and returned to grazing. That's different. He was quiet for a moment. Is that better? Managing is what's real, Mabel said. Fixed is a story we tell about things to make ourselves feel better. Real things get hurt and carry the hurt and learn to work around it. She looked at him. That's not a failure. That's just how living works. He held her gaze for a moment, and she knew they were not only talking about the horse, and he knew she knew, and neither of them made it more complicated than it needed to be. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. The question of them, the specific nature of the thing between them, which had been growing with the same quiet inevitability as everything on this land, demanding nothing, simply present, came to a head on an evening in early autumn when the air had gone cool enough to make the porch comfortable after supper. They'd been sitting there, as they sat most evenings, Mabel with her mending and Colt doing nothing in particular in the way he sometimes did, which she'd come to understand was not restlessness but a kind of active quiet, his mind working on something while his body held still. I need to ask you something, he said. All right. He was looking at the grass beyond the porch, at the way the last light was sitting on it. He had the look of a man who has been building up to something for some time, and has finally decided the building up has gone on long enough. I'm not easy to live with, he said. I know that. I leave things in the wrong place and I don't talk enough, and I go quiet when I should probably say something, and I say things straight when I should probably consider the approach first. He paused. I've been told these things. By Clara, she said. Yes, and by you, several times. Several times, she agreed. I'm not going to change all of those things, he said. Some of them I'll probably carry my whole life. I know, she said, and I'm not… He paused again, searching, the way he searched when something mattered enough to get right. I'm not an uncomplicated man. I've got grief that's not gone, and probably won't ever be entirely gone, and mornings that are harder than they look from the outside. Colt, she said, let me finish. She waited. I've been thinking about what it would look like, he said, to ask a woman like you, a woman who's already remade her life once from nothing, who has opinions about windows and coffee placement, and who talks sense to frightened horses, and who stood at an east window in the dark with a rifle when she had every reason to be somewhere safer, to ask a woman like that to stay. He turned and looked at her directly. Not as paid help, not as someone who's here because the alternative was worse. He paused. As mine, as someone I intend to make a life with properly, if she'll have that. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning in Black Ridge with flowers scattered across the dirt, and the crowd watching and no one moving. She thought about the coffee that was bad in a functional way, and the east window, and Della touching her nose to her shoulder in the early morning light, and the courthouse steps and Alice's hat with the ribbon. She thought about what it had cost him to say everything he'd just said, which was considerable, and how he'd said it anyway. She thought about Thomas, who had been a good man and not suited to his life, and how she had loved him in the way you love a thing you've grown alongside without quite knowing if you chose it or it chose you. And she thought about what this was, which was different, chosen, specifically, by two people who knew what they were choosing and what it cost and chose it anyway. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. Not because I don't have options, and not because I owe you anything, because I've watched you for months and I know what you are, which is stubborn and quiet and occasionally impossible, and one of the most genuinely decent people I've encountered in 26 years of encountering people. She held his gaze. And because this land is mine, as much as it's yours now, and I'm not leaving it. Something moved across his face that she didn't have an exact name for. Relief and recognition, and something older and quieter that was the particular expression of a man who has been alone long enough that being chosen lands differently than it used to. He reached over and took her hand. He held it with the same practicality he brought to everything. Not performing tenderness, just doing it. All right, he said. All right, she said. They sat on the porch in the cooling evening while the light finished its business with the grass and the first stars came up over the hill, and it was not a dramatic moment and not a perfect one. Her mending sat unfinished in her lap, and he still needed to check the barn before dark, and the rifle was on the porch where she'd told him not to leave it. And it was theirs, specifically and completely. They married in Iron Creek on a Tuesday in November, in the courthouse with Pruitt as witness and Dr. Marsh as the other, because those were the two people in their lives who had seen the difficult parts and stayed present, which seemed like the right qualification for witnesses. It was not a large ceremony. It was not meant to be. Colt wore his good shirt and his hat, and Mabel wore the better of her two dresses, and Dr. Marsh brought flowers that nobody had asked for, which Mabel found both unnecessary and completely welcome. The judge who performed the ceremony was efficient and genuinely pleased in the way of a man who spends most of his professional life dealing with things that have gone wrong and finds doing something that hasn't refreshing. Pruitt shook Colt's hand afterward with the grip of a man who respects what the other has come through and said, "She talked me into the expedition, you know, first morning before you were awake." "I know," Colt said. "You didn't know," Pruitt said. "I guessed," Colt said. "She doesn't wait for things to get worse if she can make them better." Pruitt looked at Mabel, who was talking to Dr. Marsh about something, and laughing. Actually laughing, the full version, which Colt had heard before but Pruitt had not, and which had the quality of something that hadn't been used enough and was making up for lost time. "No," Pruitt agreed. "She doesn't." Oh. The years after that were not a clean story with a clear shape. That's the thing that doesn't get said often enough about lives. They don't resolve into meaning the way a story does. They accumulate it, slowly, in the texture of daily things, and you don't see the shape until you're standing far enough back. What accumulated on the hill with the morning light and the large east window and the rifle on the porch that Mabel eventually stopped arguing about. The ranch became something, gradually. Not immediately, not without setbacks. There was a bad winter their second year that took 3 horses and most of their grain stores and required the kind of practical reckoning that tests whether two people's partnership is real or a comfortable arrangement that only works when things are easy. It was real. They got through it by the same method they got through everything: the daily work, the honesty, the willingness to say this is hard without saying this is too hard. Della foaled in the 3rd year. A dark colt, almost her color exactly, with a white star in the same place. He was fearless in a way his mother wasn't, which Mabel thought was exactly correct. The thing that gets carried doesn't pass forward the same way, and sometimes the generation that comes after is free in ways the one before never managed. She named him James, and when Colt looked at her when she said it, she held his gaze and didn't look away, and he nodded, once, and that was all that needed to happen. Neighboring ranchers started coming. Not because Mabel had advertised anything or set herself up as anything particular. They came because word travels in frontier country, and the word that traveled was that Mabel Maddox had a way with difficult horses, and that the advice she gave tended to be the kind that worked. They came about horses and stayed about other things, because she also had a way with difficult people, though she'd have said they were the same skill applied to different animals. She did not become someone different than she had been. That's the thing she understood best about what had happened to her. The beating in the street, the months at the ranch, the barn fire, the canyon, all of it. It had not transformed her into something she wasn't. She had been, the whole time, herself. Stubborn and patient and observant and capable of more courage than she'd known she had. Not because the hard things revealed some hidden version of her, but because hard things require you to use what's already there. She had always been someone who stood still when everything else moved, who waited, who watched, who held steady while other things came to their own conclusions. Those qualities, which had made her inconvenient in Black Ridge and had never once made her thin or decorative or easy to categorize, were the qualities that had walked her through every hard thing she'd faced and would continue to face because life does not stop providing those. She knew this. She had known it in some form since before she could have articulated it, which is how people know most true things, not as ideas, but as a quality of how they move through the world. What changed was not who she was. What changed was that she had stopped living in a place that treated who she was as a problem. One evening, 2 years into the new ranch, a woman rode in from the trail, young, alone, with the particular look of someone who has been moving for a while and doesn't yet know where they're moving toward. She asked if she could water her horse. Mabel said yes and told her to come inside and eat, because the horse wasn't the only one that needed something. The woman sat at the kitchen table with the large window behind her, in the morning light that came through it, and reached the table by 8, and she ate the soup that Mabel put in front of her and held herself very still and careful in the way of someone who has been treated badly enough that hospitality makes them suspicious. Mabel sat across from her and did not push, did not ask questions that the woman hadn't offered an opening for. Just sat in the same space and was present without demanding anything, the way you stand in a paddock with a frightened horse and wait. Eventually, the woman's shoulders came down. A fraction. Then a little more. Colt came in from the barn and looked at the table and at Mabel and at the young woman and said, "There's room in the barn for your horse. I'll put her up," and went back out. The young woman looked at the door where he'd been, looked at Mabel. "He always like that?" she said. "Yes," Mabel said. "It takes getting used to. Then you find it's actually easier." The woman was quiet for a moment. "I don't know where I'm going," she said. It came out more plainly than she'd perhaps intended. "That's all right," Mabel said. "You know where you are right now." This was the part of the story that Mabel thought about most in the years that came after. Not the dramatic moments, the barn fire, the canyon, the courthouse steps. Those moments were real and they mattered, and they were part of what she was made of now, in the way all experience is structural. But the moments that accumulated into what she'd become, the substance of it, they were moments like this one. A woman at a table, soup, a window. The choice to be still enough that frightened things could decide to move. She had learned that the cruelties done to her, the years of mockery in Black Ridge, the morning in the street, the crowd that watched without moving, had not been about her specifically. They had been about what she represented to people who needed to believe that worth was a limited resource, that it had to be protected by taking it from those deemed undeserving, as if dignity was a finite thing that ran out if too many people had it. It wasn't. She had found that out, slowly, through the accumulation of days that required her to act with dignity when no one was offering it to her from the outside. You didn't get dignity from the town's approval. You either had it or you built it from what you had at hand, and what she'd had at hand was patience and stubbornness, and a functional understanding of frightened things, and bread she baked at 4:30 in the morning for the simple reason that good bread mattered. She had built it, out of those materials, in a root cellar with a squash and 3 clean jars and a pot of ham and bean soup, in a paddock in the early morning standing still, at an east window in the dark with a rifle she'd learned 3 weeks before, on a courthouse step in November light, saying 2 names to someone who would carry them. There was an evening, she couldn't have said which year exactly, because time on the ranch had taken on the quality of water, continuous, marking itself differently than calendars did, when she was on the porch and Colt came and sat beside her, and they were watching the last light go off the hill, the way they often did, and he said, out of whatever internal process had delivered him to the question, "Do you ever think about that morning in Black Ridge?" "Sometimes," she said. "Does it—" He stopped, chose again. "Does it still cost you something?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. The flour scattered in the dirt, the crowd, Garrett's face, the specific weight of being on her hands and knees in the street with the certainty that no one was going to come. "Less than it did," she said. "Not nothing." She looked at the hill. "I think it'll always be in the inventory somewhere. Things like that don't leave entirely." She paused. "But it's not the biggest thing in the inventory anymore. There are other things that take up more room now." He was quiet for a moment. "Good things?" "Mostly," she said. "Some of them are hard things, but they're mine." She looked at him. "We're in the inventory, this land, Della, James." The foal, she meant. "Dr. Marsh, Pruitt." She paused. "Alice and her hat." He looked at her at the mention of Alice. Something in his face that was pain and gratitude and the particular expression of a man for whom having something spoken aloud is still, even years on, both difficult and necessary. "Yes," he said. "She's in the inventory," Mabel said. "All 3 of them are. That's not grief exactly. That's just keeping them." She looked at the hill again. "You said I'd stand with you, that first day." "I remember. I've been thinking about that," she said. "I used to think it meant you were telling me I'd be all right, that I'd survive." "That's not what I meant," he said. I know what you meant now." She held his gaze. "You meant it was going to be together, both of us, standing." She paused. "That's different from surviving alone. That's a different thing entirely." The light went off the hill slowly, the way it always did. and the evening came on cool and quiet, and somewhere in the paddock, James, the foal, now a 2-year-old with his mother's color and a fearlessness she'd never quite had, moved along the fence and made the sound that young horses make in the evening, comfortable, present, belonging to the place he was in. Colt reached over and took her hand the same way he'd taken it on the autumn porch, with the same practical intention, and they sat on their porch on their hill in the evening light and were two people who had come from separate broken places and made something out of the materials available, which were not extraordinary materials, and had required extraordinary work, and had produced something that was not perfect and not finished, and was absolutely real. This is what people who survive the hard thing don't often say out loud. It doesn't make the hard thing worth it. Nothing makes that worth it. What it makes is this, the life on the other side of it, the one you build from what you have left, that life can be genuinely good. Not good because of what you suffered, good because of what you did with what remained. Mabel had what remained. She sat on the porch and held her husband's hand and watched the stars come up over the hill that caught the morning light silver gold. And she was 28 years old now, which still surprised her. And she had broken ribs in her history that had healed strong, and she had a horse named Della who managed what she couldn't fix, and a foal named James who had inherited his grandmother's color and none of her fear, and a large east window, and a root cellar full of preserves, and a canvas bag with a sewing kit, and an almanac, and a photograph, and an empty space where the ammunition had been because they didn't need it anymore. She had what remained, and what remained was enough. What remained was, against everything that had tried to prevent it, a life.